Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Nightmare Narratives. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Robert Mackenzie. I'm a park ranger, and I've spent 16 years in the Superior National Forest. Before that, I was a Marine for 8 years. I've seen things that would make most people run home to their mothers, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I found in September of 1987. I'm not the kind of guy who believes in monsters. I'm a wildlife biologist. I study facts. I track animals, count populations, and write reports. When people come to me with stories about Bigfoot or werewolves, I just smile and nod. But I don't laugh anymore. Not after what happened in the Boundary Waters. The call came in on a Tuesday morning. A group of canoeists had found something strange on Pike Lake, about 40 miles from the nearest road. They said they found dead wolves, a lot of them. The way they described it over the radio made my stomach turn. "They're all in a circle," the lead canoeist said, his voice shaky, like they were protecting something, "but there's nothing in the middle. And sir, they don't look hurt. They just look dead." I loaded my canoe and gear that afternoon. The Boundary Waters is beautiful country, thousands of lakes connected by streams and rivers, surrounded by thick pine forest. It's also isolated. Once you paddle in there, you're on your own. No cell phones, no roads, no help. Just you and the wilderness. The weather was turning cold. September in northern Minnesota means the leaves are starting to change and the fog rolls in thick most mornings. The rutting season was starting too, which meant the animals were acting strange already. Bucks fighting, wolves moving their packs, bears getting ready for winter. It's always a crazy time in the woods, but this felt different from the start. I paddled for 6 hours through a maze of lakes and streams. The forest was too quiet. Normally you'd hear birds, squirrels chattering, maybe a loon calling across the water. But there was nothing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When I finally reached Pike Lake, I understood why the canoeists had sounded so scared. 7 wolves lay in a perfect circle on a small island in the middle of the lake. They were all adults, big, healthy animals that should have lived for years. But they were stone dead, lying on their sides with their heads pointing outward, like they had been guarding against something coming from every direction. I beached my canoe and walked over to them. In 20 years of studying wolves, I had never seen anything like it. There were no wounds, no blood, no sign of disease or injury. They looked like they had just laid down and died. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was that every other animal was gone. No birds, no squirrels, no insects buzzing around the dead bodies. Even the flies were gone. In a normal forest, dead animals draw scavengers within hours. These wolves had been here for at least 2 days and nothing had touched them. I set up my camp on the island and started taking pictures and notes. The wolves were all from the same pack. I could tell by their size and markings. The alpha male was huge, probably 130 pounds. The others were smaller but still impressive animals. They had been in perfect health when they died. I collected tissue samples and checked the area for clues. The ground around the wolves was torn up like there had been a huge fight. Trees were scratched and broken, but the only tracks I found belonged to the wolves themselves. That night, I sat by my campfire and tried to make sense of what I had seen. Wolves don't just die in formation. They don't arrange themselves in perfect circles. And they sure don't scare away every other living thing in a square mile of forest. I had studied wolves across North America. I knew their behavior, the fire pack structure, their hunting patterns. I had written research papers about them. I thought I knew everything there was to know about these animals. But as I looked out at those 7 dead wolves in the moonlight, I realized I might be wrong about everything. The Ojibwe people who lived in this area long before the rest of us have stories about creatures they call wahila, giant wolves that hunt like men and think like demons. I had always figured these were just old stories, legends to scare children. Sitting there in the dark, listening to the absolute silence of a forest that should have been full of life, I started to wonder if maybe the old stories were trying to tell us something important. Something was out there. Something that could kill an entire wolf pack without leaving a mark. Something that made every other animal run away and never come back. I should have packed up and left that night. I should have radioed for backup or at least told someone where I was. But I'm a scientist, and scientists don't run from mysteries. We solve them. That was my first mistake. I woke up before dawn to the sound of howling. At first I thought I was dreaming, but as I lay in my sleeping bag, the sound came again, long, mournful howls echoing across the water from the far shore of the lake. But these weren't normal wolf howls. They sounded organized, like signals. I grabbed my binoculars and crept to the edge of the island. The fog was thick, but I could make out shapes moving through the trees on the opposite shore. Big shapes, too big to be regular wolves. The howling stopped suddenly, like someone had given an order. I spent the morning setting up trail cameras and audio equipment around the island. If something was out there, I was going to document it. I placed cameras at the main portage trail near the water and in the woods where I had seen the shapes moving. By afternoon, I had finished collecting all the evidence I could from the dead wolves. 7 healthy animals, no injuries, no disease, no poison, just dead. The tissue samples would go to the lab in Duluth, but I already knew they wouldn't find anything. What worried me more was the way they had died in that perfect circle, heads facing out. It looked like they had been expecting an attack from all directions at once. But what could make a whole wolf pack so scared that they would form a defensive circle and then just die? That evening, I played back the audio recordings from the night before. What I heard made my blood run cold. The howling wasn't random. It had a pattern, like voices having a conversation. One call from the north, answered by 2 calls from the south, then a single deep howl from the east. Back and forth, like they were coordinating something. But the really scary part came at the end of the recording. Just before the howling stopped, there was a sound that didn't belong. It was a low, rumbling noise that sounded almost like laughter. I checked the trail cameras the next morning. Most of them had captured nothing but empty forest. But the camera I had placed near the main portage trail had recorded something that made me question everything I thought I knew about wildlife. The footage showed a creature moving through the trees at around 2 a.m. At first glance, it looked like a large wolf. But as I watched the recording over and over, I noticed something impossible. The creature was walking on 2 legs. It moved through the forest with perfect silence, stepping carefully around branches and rocks. Every few steps it would pause and turn its head, like it was listening for something, or watching something. The creature was huge, easily 8 feet tall when it stood upright. Its body was covered in dark fur, and its head was definitely wolf-like. But its arms were too long, and it moved with the intelligence that no animal should have. Near the end of the recording, the creature stopped directly in front of the camera. It looked sane, right into the lens for almost 30 seconds. Then it did something that made my hands shake as I watched. It nodded, like it knew I was watching. I set up more cameras that day, covering every approach to the island. I also started carrying my rifle everywhere I went. I had brought it for bear protection, but now I wasn't sure what I might need to protect myself from. The second night, they came closer. I was sitting by my campfire when I heard movement in the woods behind my tent. Not the clumsy crashing of a bear or deer, but the careful, quiet movement of something that didn't want to be heard. I picked up my flashlight and rifle and walked toward the sound. The beam of my light cut through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything moving. Still, I had the feeling I was being watched. Then I heard a stick break behind me. I spun around, bringing the rifle up, but there was nothing there. Just my tent and the dying campfire. But now I could smell something new in the air. A wild, musky scent like wet dog and something else I couldn't identify. I backed toward the fire, keeping the rifle ready. The feeling of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl. They were out there, just beyond the light, studying me. Over the next hour, I heard them moving in a circle around my camp. Always just out of sight, always quiet, but definitely there. Sometimes I would catch a glimpse of eyes reflecting my firelight. Yellow eyes, too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal. They were hunting me, but they were taking their time, learning my habits, figuring out my weaknesses. This wasn't the behavior of wild animals. This was military tactics. I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning came, I found tracks all around my campsite. They started as normal wolf prints near the water, but as they got closer to my camp, they changed. The back paws stayed the same, but the front paws became longer, more like hands. By the time the tracks reached my tent, they looked almost human. But the most disturbing thing was their size. These weren't the tracks of normal wolves. The largest prints were over 7 inches long and 4 inches wide. Whatever had made them was the size of a small bear, but with the feet of a wolf. I followed the tracks as far as I could. They led to the edge of the island and disappeared into the water. But on the far shore, I could see where they came out again. More tracks leading into the dense forest. That's when I found the shelter. Hidden in a thick stand of pines about half a mile from the lake, someone had built a lean-to shelter using fallen branches and pine boughs. But it wasn't built like any human shelter I had ever seen. It was too large, for one thing, at least 10 feet long and 8 feet wide. And the construction was weird, with branches woven together in patterns that looked almost like a giant bird's nest. Inside the shelter, I found bones. Lots of bones. Deer, moose, beaver, and smaller animals. But they weren't just scattered around like a normal predator's den. They were arranged in neat piles, organized by size and type. Some of the larger bones had been shaped into points, like crude tools or weapons. In the center of the shelter, there was a circle of stones arranged around a pile of ashes. They had been using fire. Wolves don't use fire. Bears don't use fire. Only humans use fire. But these weren't humans. I took pictures of everything and got out of there fast. As I walked back toward the lake, I had the strong feeling that I was being followed. Every few minutes I would stop and listen, but I never heard anything. Still, the feeling never went away. That afternoon, I checked my trail cameras again. This time, all 6 cameras had recorded visitors. The creatures had found every single camera and had spent time examining them. The footage showed at least 4 different individuals, all walking upright, all impossibly large. But the most chilling part was at the end of each recording. Every creature, after examining the camera, had done the same thing. They had looked directly into the lens and nodded, like they were greeting me personally. They knew I was watching. And they wanted me to know that they were watching back. By the 4th day, I knew I was in serious trouble. The creatures, I had started thinking of them as dogmen, because I didn't know what else to call them, had become bolder. They no longer waited for darkness to move around. I could see them during the day now, standing at the edge of the forest across the lake, watching my camp. There were 7 of them, the same number as the dead wolves. I had tried to radio for help, but my radio wasn't working. The battery was fine, and I had checked all the connections, but I couldn't raise anyone. It was like something was jamming the signal. The night before, they had gotten even closer to my camp. I had woken up to find my canoe moved 15 feet up the beach from where I had left it. My food pack, which I had hung 10 feet up in a tree, was sitting on the ground beside my tent. Nothing was missing, but the message was clear. We can get to anything you have, anytime we want. I was dealing with creatures that had the size and strength of bears, the pack intelligence of wolves, and problem-solving abilities that rivaled humans, and they were playing with me. The morning of the 4th day, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of hiding in my camp, I would observe them. I loaded my canoe and paddled to the far shore to a spot where I could watch their movements without being easily seen. I didn't have to wait long. Around noon, I heard a sound that made me grab my binoculars. It was the bellow of a bull moose in distress. Through the trees, I could see a huge male moose crashing through the underbrush, running from something. Then I saw the dogmen in action. 3 of them were chasing the moose. But they weren't just running after it like normal predators. They were working together, driving it toward a specific spot. One would appear from the left to turn the moose right, then another would show up from the right to turn it left again. They were herding it like cowboys herding cattle. The moose was huge, probably 1,400 pounds, but it was panicking. Every time it tried to escape in one direction, a dog man would appear to cut it off. They were forcing it toward a small clearing where the other 4 pack members were waiting. When the moose reached the clearing, the trap was sprung. The lead dog man, the largest one, standing almost 10 feet tall, stepped out of the trees directly in front of the moose. The animal skidded to a stop, snorting and pawing the ground. For a moment, the 2 huge creatures stared at each other. Then the dogman did something that made me nearly drop my binoculars. It raised one massive arm and pointed to the left. The moose incredibly looked in that direction. When it turned its head back, the dogman pointed to the right. Again, the moose looked. It was like the dogman was giving the moose directions or commands. The moose stood there for almost a full minute, as if it was trying to decide what to do. The other dogmen formed a loose circle around it, but they didn't attack. They just waited. Finally, the moose lowered its massive head and walked slowly toward the alpha dogman. When it got close enough, the creature reached out one clawed hand and touched the moose's forehead, almost gently. The moose collapsed instantly, just like the wolves. The pack fed on the moose for about an hour, but even their feeding behavior was strange. They took turns, with the alpha eating first, then the others in what looked like a strict hierarchy. There was no fighting, no competition. Everything was organized, disciplined. When they were finished, they did something that made my blood run cold. The alpha dogman looked directly across the lake at my hiding spot and nodded. Then all 7 of them melted back into the forest. They had known I was watching the entire time. The whole hunt had been a demonstration. They were showing me what they could do. That evening, they visited my camp again. This time, they didn't try to hide. I could see them moving around the edge of the island, circling my position. Every few minutes, one of them would step into the light from my campfire, just long enough for me to get a good look. They were magnificent and terrifying. Each one was different. Some had darker fur, others were lighter. Some were bulkier, others more lean. But all of them were huge, powerful, and intelligent. Their eyes held an awareness that no animal should have. The alpha was the largest and most impressive. His fur was almost black, and scars crisscrossed his massive chest and arms. When he looked at me, I felt like I was being judged by something that was trying to decide if I was a threat, prey, or something else entirely. Around midnight, they started communicating with each other. Not howling this time, but a series of low barks, growls, and what sounded almost like words. The sounds came from all around the island, like they were having a conversation while surrounding me. I sat by my fire with my rifle across my knees, trying to look calm while my heart hammered in my chest. I was outnumbered, outmatched, and probably outthought. If they wanted to kill me, there was nothing I could do to stop them. But they didn't attack. Instead, around 2 a.m., they did something even more unsettling. They started to sing. It began with a low humming sound from the alpha, somewhere in the woods to my north. Then the others joined in, one by one, until all 7 voices were harmonizing in a sound that was part wolf howl, part human singing, and part something else entirely. The song had a melody, a structure. It rose and fell like a lament or a prayer. And somehow, even though I couldn't understand any words, I knew what it meant. They were mourning their pack members, the 7 wolves I had found dead on the island. The song lasted for almost an hour. When it ended, forest fell completely silent again. I waited until dawn, but they didn't make another sound. In the morning, I found a gift waiting for me. Placed carefully next to my tent was the skull of the moose they had killed the day before. It had been cleaned perfectly, every bit of flesh removed, but that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was that the skull had been decorated. Small bones from birds and rodents were arranged around it in intricate patterns. Stones had been placed in the eye sockets, and carved into the bone, in symbols I didn't recognize, was what looked like a message. I photographed everything and packed it carefully with my other evidence. Then I sat down and tried to figure out what to do next. I was 40 miles from the nearest road, surrounded by creatures that seemed to be part wolf, part human, and part something else entirely. They had been playing with me for 4 days, demonstrating their power, studying my behavior, and making it clear that they could kill me anytime they wanted. But they hadn't killed me. Instead, they had shown me their hunting skills, shared their morning ritual, and given me a gift. The question was, what did they want? I was about to find out. On the 5th morning, they came for me. I woke up to find the alpha dogman standing at the edge of my campsite, not hiding, not skulking, just standing there watching me sleep. When I sat up in my sleeping bag, he didn't run or move back into the trees. He just stood there, waiting. In the daylight, he was even more impressive than I had realized. He stood nearly 10 feet tall, with shoulders almost 4 feet wide. His fur was thick and dark, with silver streaks around his muzzle and hands. His arms were longer than human arms, but shorter than a gorilla's, ending in hands that looked like a mixture of human fingers and wolf claws. But it was his eyes that really got to me. They were yellow, like a wolf's, but they held intelligence. Not animal cunning, but real thought. He was studying me the same way I had been studying him, trying to figure out what I was and what I wanted. We stared at each other for almost 5 minutes without moving. Then he did something that made my heart stop. He spoke. "You stay." The words were rough, like they were being forced through a throat that wasn't designed for human speech, but they were definitely words. "You learn." I slowly reached for my rifle, but he shook his head, a completely human gesture. "No, hurt," he said. "You come." He turned and walked toward the forest, then stopped and looked back at me. The message was clear. Follow me, or else. I grabbed my rifle and followed him into the woods. He led me to a clearing about half a mile from my camp. The other 6 dogmen were waiting there, arranged in a circle. They were all standing upright, arms at their sides, like soldiers at attention. In the center of the circle was another decorated skull, this one from a deer, and more of those strange bone arrangements. The alpha walked to the center of the circle and gestured for me to join him. Every instinct I had told me this was a trap, that I was walking into my own death. But I had studied enough animal behavior to recognize what was happening. This was a dominance challenge. The alpha began to pace around me, his eyes never leaving mine. The other 6 watched without moving or making a sound. Every few steps, he would stop and make a noise, part growl, part word. I couldn't understand most of it, but some sounds were familiar. "Pack," he said at one point, gesturing to the others. "Territory," he said, sweeping his arm toward the forest. "Mine." He was telling me that this was his pack's territory, and I was trespassing. Then he pointed at me and made a questioning sound. He wanted to know what I was doing here, why I had come into his territory, and what I intended to do about his dead pack members. I tried to explain, using simple words and gestures like he had. I pointed to the dead wolves on the island, then to myself, then made a questioning gesture. I was trying to tell him that I had come to investigate their deaths, not to hurt anyone. He listened carefully, his head tilted like a dog trying to understand a command. When I finished, he walked over to one of the bone arrangements and picked up what looked like a wolf's leg bone that had been carved into a spear point. He held it out to me, handle first. It was another test. He was offering me a weapon, seeing if I would take it, seeing if I intended to fight him. I looked at the bone spear, then at his massive claws and teeth, then at the 6 other dogmen surrounding us. Fighting him would be suicide, but refusing the weapon might be seen as cowardice or disrespect. I took the spear. He nodded approvingly, then picked up his own weapon, a club made from what looked like a moose antler. He hefted it experimentally, testing its weight and balance. Then he attacked. He was faster than anything that size should have been. The club whistled past my head as I dove to the side, rolling and coming up with the bone spear ready. He spun and swung again, and this time the club caught me in the ribs, lifting me off my feet and sending me flying. I hit the ground hard, gasping for breath. He could have finished me then, but he waited, letting me get back up. This wasn't about killing me. It was about establishing dominance, about determining my place in his pack's hierarchy. We fought for maybe 20 minutes. He was stronger, faster, and had natural weapons I couldn't match. But I had military training and 16 years of wilderness experience. I used my smaller size to my advantage, staying mobile, using the environment, making him work for every hit. I managed to land a few strikes with the bone spear, drawing blood from his arms and chest. Each time I hit him, he would nod approvingly, like I had passed another test. Finally, he landed a blow that sent me sprawling, and I couldn't get up fast enough. His massive hand closed around my throat, and he lifted me off the ground like I weighed nothing. For a moment, I thought he was going to kill me. His claws pressed against my neck, and I could see my death in his yellow eyes. But instead, he set me down gently and stepped back. Then he did something incredible. He knelt. Not a full kneel, but he lowered himself until we were at the same height, a gesture of respect between equals. Around the circle, the other dogmen made sounds that might have been approval. "You fight well," he said in his rough, deep voice. "You, not prey." He stood up and walked to the bone arrangement in the center of the circle. From among the decorated skulls and carved bones, he picked up something small and held it out to me. It was a tooth, a wolf's canine tooth, carved with tiny symbols and hung on a leather cord. I took it, understanding that it was some kind of badge or token. He was accepting me into his territory, not as a pack member, but as something like a neutral neighbor. "You go now," he said, pointing toward my camp. "Come back when you're ready." Ready for what? I wondered. But I didn't ask. I had pushed my luck far enough for one day. I walked back to my camp on shaky legs, the carved tooth hanging around my neck. Behind me, I could hear the pack moving through the forest, but they weren't following me. They were going about their business, whatever that was. That afternoon, I sat by my fire and tried to process what had happened. I had just fought hand-to-hand with a creature that shouldn't exist, a being that was part wolf, part human, and part something else entirely. And not only had I survived, but he had accepted me as, what? An ally? A worthy opponent? As the sun went down, I heard them howling again. But this time the sound was different. It was still mournful, still haunting, but there was something else in it now, something that might have been acceptance. They were letting me know that I could stay in their territory, at least for now, but they were also warning me that I was being watched, that any wrong move would change our delicate truce. I fingered the carved tooth around my neck and wondered what I had gotten myself into, and more importantly, what I was going to do about it when I got back to civilization, because nobody was going to believe this. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But the tooth was real. The scars on my ribs were real. And somewhere out in the forest, 7 impossible creatures were going about their lives, hunting and thinking and mourning their dead. The world was a lot stranger than I had ever imagined. That was 38 years ago. I never filed an official report about what I found in the Boundary Waters. How could I? Pack of intelligent wolfmen killed an entire wolf pack and then accepted me into their territorial hierarchy after a ritual combat isn't the kind of thing you put in government paperwork. Instead, I wrote up a standard report about finding dead wolves with an unknown cause of death. The tissue samples came back negative for everything, just as I had expected. The case was filed away and forgotten, but I never forgot. I kept the carved tooth. I still wear it, even now. And I went back to Pike Lake 3 more times over the years, always alone, always carefully. The first time, about a year later, I found fresh signs of the pack's presence. More bone arrangements, more shelters, evidence of their sophisticated hunting techniques. They were still there, still thriving, still learning. I left gifts, tools, blankets, sometimes food. Not because I thought they needed them, but as a sign of respect. The gifts were always gone when I returned, replaced by small tokens of their own. More carved bones, interesting stones, sometimes the skull of an animal they had killed. We developed a strange relations. hip over the years. I was the human who knew about them but didn't try to expose them or hunt them. They were the impossible pack that had accepted one man into the edges of their world, the calm. Second time I went back, 5 years later, I met the alpha again. He had aged, more silver in his fur, more scars on his massive frame. But he remembered me. "You come back," he said, and I swear he sounded pleased. We didn't fight this time. Instead, he showed me things. Their new shelters, more sophisticated now with actual stone foundations. Tools they had made, not just sharpened bones, but complex implements. Evidence of a culture, a society developing in the deep wilderness. The third and last time I returned was 10 years ago. The alpha was gone, died of old age, I think, the way all wild animals eventually do. But his son had taken over the pack, and he remembered me too. "You, friend," he told me. "You, keep secret." I nodded. I had kept their secret for decades, and I would keep it until I died. But that young alpha taught me something important. He showed me a cave deep in the forest, hidden behind a waterfall where no human would ever think to look. Inside were paintings on the walls, crude but recognizable pictures telling the story of his people. They hadn't always been what they were now. The paintings showed normal wolves, then something changing them, making them larger, more intelligent, more human-like. The change had happened gradually, over many generations. They were evolving, and they weren't the only ones. The paintings showed other packs in other forests, in other states. The dogmen weren't unique to northern Minnesota. They were spreading, growing, adapting to a world that was changing around them. I realized that I hadn't just discovered a pack of unusual predators. I had glimpsed the future of wildlife in North America. As human development pushed deeper into the wilderness, some animals were adapting in ways that science hadn't yet imagined. The wolves were becoming something new, something that could think and plan and work together in ways that would let them survive in a world dominated by humans. I retired from the Forest Service 15 years ago, but I kept studying cryptid sightings and anomalous predator behavior. Officially, I consult for the Wildlife Department on unusual animal attacks. Unofficially, I investigate reports that sound like they might involve evolved predators. There have been more sightings over the years, not just in Minnesota, but in Wisconsin, Michigan, Montana, and Alaska. Always in deep wilderness areas. Always in places where wolves and humans occasionally come into conflict. The pattern is spreading. I'm 83 years old now, and I won't be around much longer. But I've trained a few younger researchers, people I trust to continue the work. They think they're studying folklore and urban legends. They don't know they're documenting the next step in evolution. The dogmen are still out there, still learning, still adapting, still becoming something more than they were. And someday, maybe sooner than we think, they're going to decide that they're ready to stop hiding. When that day comes, I hope we're ready for them, because they've been getting ready for us for a very long time. The carved tooth around my neck has worn smooth after all these years of handling. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my cabin, I take it out and look at the symbols carved into it. I never did figure out what they mean. But I have a theory. I think it's my name, in their language. The name they gave to the human who fought their alpha and lived, who kept their secrets and respected their territory. The human who became, in some small way, part of their pack. And on quiet nights, when the wind is right and the forest is still, I can sometimes hear them howling in the distance. It's a lonely sound, but it's not sad anymore. It's the sound of a species that's learning to survive in a world that doesn't believe in them yet. My name is Michael Stonecrow, and I've been a park ranger at Yosemite for 19 years. That's long enough to know every trail, every cave, and every dangerous spot that can kill you if you're not careful. It's also long enough to stop believing in the old stories my grandmother used to tell. I became a ranger to protect these lands. They're sacred to my people, the Miwok tribe. My grandmother always said the mountains had spirits, and some of them were angry about all the tourists tramping through. But after 2 decades of search and rescue, after pulling bodies out of crevasses and finding lost hikers half dead from cold, I learned that the real dangers were simple things: rock falls, flash floods, people who thought they knew better than nature. The old woman used to tell me about the bone dancers. Giants, she said, who lived in the deep places and collected human bones to build bridges between the world of the living and the dead. "Stay away from Devil's Canyon," she'd whisper when I was small. "That's where they gather the pieces." I always thought those stories were just meant to keep kids from wandering off. October 28, 1974, started like any normal day. The first snow had fallen the night before, just a light dusting that made everything look clean and new. Hunting season was starting, so we'd be busy with weekend warriors who didn't know the difference between a deer trail and a cliff edge. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees overnight, and more snow was coming. That's when the call came in about the missing climbers. 3 experienced rock climbers had been working Devil's Canyon for the past week. Tom Bradley, Sarah Chen, and Mike Hoffman, all of them skilled, all of them careful. They'd checked in with us Monday, filed their route plan like good climbers do. They were supposed to be back Wednesday. It was Friday, and nobody had heard from the Monsieur. Devil's Canyon sits 15 miles from the nearest road, deep in the backcountry where cell phones don't work, and the granite walls rise straight up for hundreds of feet. It's beautiful, but it's also dangerous. The canyon is narrow, full of hidden caves and unstable rock. My people buried their dead there for centuries, until the white settlers came and said it was government land now. I took 2 junior rangers with me, Rodriguez and Kelly, both good kids but new to the job. We loaded up with standard search gear, ropes, medical supplies, emergency radios. The plan was simple: follow the climber's route, look for signs, bring them home. The hike in took 3 hours through snow that was getting deeper with each step. The silence bothered me first. Usually you hear birds in these mountains, even in late fall, squirrels chattering, wind in the pines. But as we got closer to Devil's Canyon, everything went quiet. Even our footsteps seemed too loud. "Radio check," I called when we reached the canyon rim. Rodriguez tried his radio, got nothing but static. Kelly's was the same. "Must be the rock formations," I said. "Radio waves don't bounce right in narrow canyons." That was true, but it didn't explain why my compass was spinning like a drunken sailor, or why the GPS unit was showing coordinates that put us somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. We rappelled down into the canyon, following the route the climbers had planned. The walls closed in around us, dark granite streaked with quartz that glittered in the weak sunlight. Our voices echoed strangely, coming back distorted and wrong. That's when we found the first gear. It was about halfway down the canyon wall, maybe 200 feet up from the bottom. A full rack of climbing equipment, ropes, cams, carabiners, arranged in a perfect spiral pattern on a tiny ledge. No way to reach it without technical climbing, and no omachi gate and chore points anywhere nearby. It looked like someone had flown up there and carefully placed each piece in exactly the right spot. "Could be rockfall," Rodriguez suggested. "Maybe their gear got caught when some rocks came down." I wanted to believe that. I'd seen rockfall do strange things, scatter equipment in ways that didn't make sense. But this wasn't scattered. This was arranged. Someone had taken time to make that spiral pattern, and I couldn't think of any reason why 3 experienced climbers would waste time on something like that. We kept searching. The canyon bottom was filled with house-sized boulders that had fallen from the walls over the centuries. Perfect hiding spots, or perfect places for someone to get trapped if another rock decided to fall. We called their names, listened for responses, found nothing. It was Kelly who spotted the bone. "Hey, Mike," she called, using the casual name all the young rangers called me. "What do you make of this?" She was standing beside a pool of snowmelt, holding something white. A human femur, by the look of it. But it had been carved with symbols I recognized from my grandmother's old stories. Miwok death markers, the signs that told spirits how to find their way home. The breaks in the bone were fresh, still showing white at the edges. Someone had been working on this recently. "Could be from the old burial ground," I said, though I didn't believe it. The Miwok graves were deeper in the canyon, and we'd sealed them off years ago after too many tourists tried to take souvenirs. Sometimes the weather uncovers old remains. But even as I said it, I was thinking about my grandmother's stories. about giants who collected human bones like other people collected stamps. I made a decision that probably saved Rodriguez and Kelly's lives, though it nearly cost me mine. "You two head back," I told them. "Get on the radio as soon as you're clear of the canyon. Call for a full search team with climbing gear. I'm going to keep looking." "That's against protocol," Rodriguez said. "We're not supposed to split up." "This is my call," I said. "These people have been out here for days. If they're hurt, every hour counts." They didn't want to leave me, but they followed orders. Good kids. I watched them climb out of the canyon, their voices fading as they disappeared over the rim. Then I was alone with the silence and the spiraling shadows. That's when I heard the water. There was a waterfall at the far end of Devil's Canyon that I'd never seen before. I'd been in this canyon dozens of times over the years. I knew every rock, every crevice, every place where water collected after storms. But as I followed the sound deeper into the narrow passage, I found a 20-foot waterfall pouring out of what looked like solid rock. The water was warm. That was the first thing that told me something was wrong. It was October, with snow on the ground, but steam was rising from the pool at the base of the falls. The water should have been ice cold, maybe even frozen. Instead, it felt like a hot spring. Behind the waterfall, barely visible through the curtain of water, I could see an opening in the rock. The same symbols I'd found on the bone fragment were carved around the entrance, worn smooth by centuries of weather. I should have waited for backup, should have climbed out and called for the full search team. But 20 years of successful rescues had made me confident, maybe too confident. If the climbers were in that cave, they needed help now, not in 6 hours when the cavalry arrived. I squeezed through the opening behind the waterfall and found myself in a tunnel that stretched back into darkness. My flashlight beam bounced off wet stone walls covered with more carvings. Not just Miwok symbols now, but pictures, stick figures dancing around piles of what looked like bones, giants with too many arms reaching down to touch smaller human shapes. The tunnel opened into a cavern bigger than a Ceus, a cathedral. My flashlight couldn't reach the ceiling and the walls disappeared into shadow on both sides. But what I could see made my stomach drop. Bones. Thousands of them. Maybe tens of thousands. Not scattered like you'd expect in a cave where animals came to die. These were arranged, organized, built into structures that looked almost like architecture. A wall of human skulls 20 feet high with gaps left for windows. Rib cages stacked like cordwood, interwoven with what looked like mammoth tusks. Leg bones arranged in perfect spirals that reminded me of the climbing gear we'd found on the canyon wall. And in the center of it all, something that made my hands shake as I held the flashlight. A bridge. Or the beginning of one. Human bones fitted together with impossible precision, creating an arch that spanned a chasm I couldn't see the bottom of. It was beautiful and terrible, like something you might find in a nightmare about cathedrals. The bridge was unfinished. Gaps in the structure showed where more bones were needed. And I realized, with the kind of cold certainty that hits you in moments of pure terror, that the missing climbers weren't missing anymore. They were going to become part of this thing. That's when I heard the clicking. It started soft, like wind chimes made of hollow sticks. But as I stood there listening, it got louder and more rhythmic. Click, 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 pause. Click, 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 pause. Like someone walking, but with too many legs, or legs that weren't quite the right shape. The sound was coming from deeper in the cave. I should have run. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out, to get back to the surface and radio for help. But somewhere in that darkness, 3 people might still be alive. That's what I told myself as I followed the clicking deeper into the cavern. The tunnel branched and branched again, creating a maze of passages that all looked the same in the flashlight beam. The symbols on the walls got more elaborate the deeper I went, until they stopped looking like pictures and started looking like ritis, in a language I didn't recognize, carved into stone with tools that must have been incredibly precise. I found the first climber in a side passage about 50 yards from the main cavern. Tom Bradley was alive, technically. He was sitting against the wall, eyes open, breathing steadily. But his arms were gone. Not cut off, replaced. Where his human arms should have been, Someone had grafted on arm bones that looked ancient. The joints were sealed with what looked like clay or dried mud, and when I called his name, he turned to look at me with eyes that didn't seem to recognize anything. "Tom," I whispered. "Tom, can you hear me?" He opened his mouth and made a sound like wind through dry leaves. Then he lifted one of those ancient bone arms and pointed deeper into the cave. "They're building something," he said, and his voice was his own voice, but distant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "They're building a bridge for the dancers to cross back over." The clicking sound was getting closer. I grabbed Tom under what was left of his normal shoulders and tried to lift him, but he was heavier than he should have been. The bone grafts had added weight, and they didn't move quite right. It was like trying to carry a person made partly of stone. "Leave me," he said. "You have to see what they're building. You have to understand. I'm getting you out of here." But even as I said it, I could hear the clicking echoing from the passage behind me. Getting closer. And there was something else now, a sound like singing, but in a language that was old when the pyramids were young. I dragged Tom as far as I could, but the passage narrowed to a crawl space that I could barely fit through alone. He was right. I had to leave him, but I promised myself I'd come back with help. The clicking stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing, Timu, a drip of water somewhere in the distance. And then, from a passage I was sure had been empty a moment before, I heard a voice. It was speaking Miwok, words my grandmother had taught me when I was young. But the voice that spoke them was wrong, too deep, too hollow, like it was coming from inside a drum. "Michael Stonecrow," it said, "grandson of Dancing Bear Woman, we have been waiting for you." I ran. I crawled through that narrow passage, scraping my back on stone, my flashlight beam dancing crazily as I tried to move fast and not get stuck. Behind me, the clicking started again. But it was different now, faster. Multiple sources, like a whole crowd of whatever was in there, had started moving at once. I emerged into another cavern and found Sarah Chen. She was hanging from the wall, but not the way you'd expect. Someone had carefully embedded her into the rock itself, her bones extending into the stone like she was growing out of it. Her legs were gone completely, replaced with what looked like tree roots made of fossilized bone. But she was alive, and when she saw me, she smiled. "It doesn't hurt," she said. That's the strangest thing. You'd think it would hurt, but it doesn't. They're very careful, very precise. "Sarah, I'm going to get you down from there." "You can't," she said, and her voice was dreamy, like she was talking about something that had happened to someone else. "I'm part of it now, part of the bridge. We all are." The clicking was getting closer, and now I could see lights in the passages around me. Not electric lights, but something that glowed with a cold blue fire. "Where's Mike?" I asked. "Where's Mike Hoffman?" Sarah's smile got wider, showing teeth that had been replaced with something that looked like polished jade. "Oh," she said. "Mike got special treatment. He's helping with the construction now." That's when I saw the giant. It was 12 feet tall and made of bones from 100 different creatures. Human skulls formed its torso, held together with what looked like mammoth ribs. Its arms were constructed from zens of different arm bones, human, bear, something that might have been dinosaur, all fitted together like a puzzle that only made sense in nightmares. When it moved, everything clicked and rattled like a percussion section made of skeletons. But the worst part was that it was beautiful. Whoever had built this thing understood anatomy better than any surgeon. Every bone was perfectly placed, every joint sealed with clay that had been painted with symbols in languages that were old when English was just grunts around campfires. It moved with grace that no human could match, flowing from one position to another like water made of calcium and terror. And riding on its shoulders, fused into its structure like a living crown, was Mike Hoffman. Mike's torso was still mostly human, but his legs had been replaced with what looked like eagle talons, and his arms now ended in bear claws that gleamed like polished steel. His head was tilted at an angle that should have been impossible, and when he spoke, his voice harmonized with itself like he was singing in three-part harmony. "Michael," he said, and all three voices knew my name. "The Bone Dancer has been waiting so long to meet you." The giant stepped forward, and I could see that its feet were made of human hands, dozens of them, all reaching down to grip the stone floor. It moved without sound despite its size, flowing across the cavern like smoke. I raised my flashlight like it was a weapon, which was stupid, but terror makes you do stupid things. "What do you want?" I managed to say. Mike, who wasn't Mike anymore, tilted his head like a bird studying a worm. "We want what we've always wanted. To finish the bridge. To bring our people back from the place where the white soldiers sent them." The giant spoke then, and its voice was like rocks falling into deep water. But somehow, I understood every word. "Your grandmother told you stories," it said, "but she did not tell you why we collect bones. She did not tell you that we were once human, like you." The creature reached up with one impossibly long arm and lifted Mike down from its shoulders, set him gently on the ground, where he stood on those eagle talons like they'd been his legs all his life. "I was a shaman," the giant continued. "When the white soldiers came with their guns and their diseases, when they drove our people from these sacred places and locked them in cages they called reservations, I chose to stay. I chose to become something that could fight back." It gestured to the bone bridge with arms that creaked like old trees in wind. "But one shaman cannot bring back a whole tribe, cannot rebuild a nation from scattered bones. I need help. I need others who understand what was lost." "So you kill people," I said. "You murder climbers and hikers." "We improve them," Mike said, flexing those bare claws. "We make them better than they were, stronger, ready for the war that's coming." The giant took another step toward me, and I could smell it now. Old bone and wet earth and something like incense that had been burning for centuries. "You are Miwok," it said. "You are Ranger. You know these mountains better than any white man ever will. With your knowledge and our power, we can build an army that will take back what was stolen." I thought about my grandmother's stories, about warriors who became bridges between worlds, about the price of fighting monsters. "And if I say no?" The giant smiled, and its smile was made of 100 different skulls. "Then you become part of the bridge anyway. But it will take much longer, and you will not retain as much of yourself." That's when I realized the clicking I'd been hearing wasn't just the giant moving. There were others. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, moving through passages all around me. The sound of bone on stone, getting closer from every direction. I tried to run, but Mike was faster than any human should be. Those eagle talons gave him speed and grip that let him scuttle up the wall and drop down in front of me like a spider made of nightmares and surgical precision. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, and his bare claws gleamed in the flashlight beam. "We really do want to help you, help your people." I dodged around him and made it maybe 20 yards before I ran into the others. They came out of passages I hadn't even seen, creatures that had once been human, but were now something else entirely. A woman whose legs had been replaced with the hindquarters of a deer, moving through the cavern in bounds that covered impossible distances. A man whose torso was built from bear ribs, his arms now tipped with claws that could tear through stone. And all of them were beautiful in their terrible way. All of them moved with grace that spoke of careful craftsmanship and artistic vision. These weren't random monsters. They were masterpieces of bone sculpture, living art that happened to be made from people who used to have names and families and dreams. They surrounded me but didn't attack, just stood there, clicking and rattling softly, while the giant approached with footsteps that sounded like distant thunder. "You see," it said, "we are not destroyers. We are builders. We take what is broken and make it whole. We take what is weak and make it strong." One of the creatures stepped forward, and I recognized what was left of Sarah Chen. The tree roots that had replaced her legs had grown, spreading out into the rock floor like she was putting down permanent roots. Her arms were now made of interwoven bird bones that let her reach impossible distances. "It really doesn't hurt," she said, and her voice was like wind in leaves. You just become more than you were. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. How many? I asked. How many people have you taken? The giant gestured to the cavern around us, and for the first time I realized how big it really was. The bone structures I'd seen were just the beginning. In the darkness beyond my flashlight beam, I could make out more shapes. Walls made of human remains, towers built from femurs and skulls, and everywhere the soft clicking of creatures that had once been hikers and climbers and people who'd just gotten lost in the wrong canyon. 67 over the past century, the giant said. Each one chosen carefully, each one improved, each one now part of something greater than they could ever have been alone. The bridge stretched out in front of me, its bone arches reaching across that impossible chasm, and I could see now that it was almost finished. Just a few more pieces, a few more people, and whatever was on the other side of that gap would be able to cross over. What's over there? I asked, pointing across the chasm. The giant's skull smile got wider. Home, it said. The place where our people went when the soldiers came. The place where they're waiting for us to build them a way back. I thought about my grandmother, who'd died when I was 12, about all the Miwok who'd been driven from these mountains and never got to see them again, about the injustices that had been done and the people who'd been lost. And I realized that part of me wanted to let the giant finish its bridge. But then I thought about Tom Bradley, sitting in that passage with ancient arms that weren't his own, about Sarah, growing into the wall like some kind of human tree, about Mike, who'd probably had a family somewhere who was wondering why he hadn't come home. No, I said. The giant tilted its massive head. No? No, I won't help you. And I won't let you finish this. The creatures around me started clicking faster, a sound like a rattlesnake warning multiplied by dozens. Mike stepped forward, those bear claws extending. Then you'll become part of the bridge, he said. And your bones will be especially useful since you know every trail and every cave in these mountains. Your knowledge will become ours. That's when I remembered what my grandmother had taught me about fighting monsters. You don't fight their strength. You fight their weakness. I closed my eyes and started to sing. It was an old song, one my grandmother had taught me when I was 7 years old and afraid of the dark. A death song, she'd called it, for helping spirits find their way to the next world. I hadn't sung it in 30 years, but the words came back like they'd been waiting in my throat all this time. The clicking stopped. In the sudden silence, my voice echoed off the cavern walls, coming back changed and layered until it sounded like a whole choir was singing with me. The bone creatures stood frozen, their heads tilted like they were listening to something they'd almost forgotten. The giant took a step back. "What are you doing?" Mike demanded, but his 3-part harmony voice was shaking now. I kept singing, and with each verse, I could feel something changing in the cavern. The cold blue lights that had been glowing from the passages started to flicker and dim. The air itself seemed to get thinner, like it was being pulled away to somewhere else. "Stop," the giant said, and for the first time its voice sounded uncertain. "You don't understand what you're doing." But I was starting to understand exactly what I was doing. My grandmother hadn't just taught me a death song, she'd taught me a separation song, a way to help spirits let go of the things that were keeping them tied to this world. The giant had been human once, a shaman who'd chosen to merge with bones and earth and old magic to fight for his people. But that was over a century ago. The war he'd been fighting was over. The people he'd been trying to save were gone. All that was left was the rage and the refusal to let go. I sang louder, putting everything I had into the old words. Around me, the bone creatures started to sway, their clicks becoming something that almost sounded like harmony. Sarah's tree-root legs began to withdraw from the stone walls. The deer-legged woman's eyes cleared for the first time since I'd seen her. "Please," the giant said, and its voice was smaller now, more human. "Don't make me go. Don't make me leave them alone again." "They're not alone," I sang, weaving the words into the melody. "They're waiting for you. On the other side. Your people are waiting." The bridge began to glow. Not with the cold blue light I'd seen before, but with something warmer. Golden, like sunrise through pine trees. And I could see shapes moving on the other side of the chasm now, figures that looked almost solid, reaching out across the gap. My grandmother was there. I could see her clearly now, still wearing the blue dress she'd been buried in. She was smiling and holding out her hands. The giant saw her too. Its massive frame shuddered, and for a moment it looked less like a monster and more like a very old, very tired man. "Dancing bear woman," it whispered. "You came back." "I never left," I heard her voice say, though it might have been the echo of my own singing. "I was just waiting for you to stop fighting and come home." The creature that had been Mike Hoffman fell to its knees, those bear claws scraping against stone. The surgical perfection that had held his transformed body together was coming apart, ancient bones separating from human flesh with sounds like snapping twigs. "I can't," he said, but his voice was his own voice now, scared and human. "I can't remember what I was before." "You were a climber," I told him, still singing but weaving words into the melody. "You loved mountains and clean rock and the feeling of being higher than the birds. You had a girlfriend named Amy who made terrible coffee and great pancakes." He looked up at me with eyes that were fully human for the first time since I'd found him. "Amy," he whispered. "I remember Amy." One by one, the bone creatures were falling apart, not violently, but gently, like flowers losing their petals. The human parts remained, freed from the ancient bones that had been grafted onto them. Tom Bradley crawled out of the side passage, his real arms restored, looking confused but alive. The giant was the last to change. It stood in the center of the cavern, bones clicking and rattling as the magic that held it together finally began to let go. But instead of falling apart, it was growing brighter, more transparent. "Will you tell them?" it asked, and I could see through it now to the glowing bridge beyond. "Will you tell people what happened here? What we were trying to do?" "I'll tell them," I promised. The giant nodded, and then it stepped onto the bridge. The bones that had made up its body scattered as it walked, falling like snow into the chasm below. But the shape that walked across that span of light was human again. A man in buckskin and feathers, carrying the weight of a century's rage and finally ready to put it down. My grandmother met him in the middle of the bridge, and they walked together into the golden light on the other side. The bridge faded. The chasm sealed itself like it had never been there. And we were alone in a cavern that was suddenly just a cavern, full of ordinary rocks and ordinary darkness. "What happened?" Tom Bradley asked, flexing fingers that were his own again. "We got lost," I said, and started leading them toward the tunnel that would take us back to the world above. But now we're found. The search and rescue team found us 3 days later, hypothermic and dehydrated, but alive. We'd managed to make it back to the canyon floor before exhaustion and the cold overcame us. The official report attributed our survival to luck and ranger training, and the strange things we'd experienced to hallucinations brought on by exposure and stress. The Park Service sealed Devil's Canyon indefinitely. Unstable geological conditions, they said. Risk of rockfall. They put up signs and barriers, and eventually people stopped asking questions about what had really happened down there. But things had changed. Tom Bradley quit, climbing after that, and became a park ranger himself. He said being in the mountains felt different now, like he could hear things other people couldn't. Sarah Chen moved back to California and started working with Native American cultural preservation groups. Mike Hoffman married his girlfriend Amy and opened a coffee shop in Bishop where he makes the best pancakes in the Eastern Sierra. And me? I found that my bones had become denser, harder than they should be. Over the next 20 years, I never broke so much as a finger, even during rescues that should have killed me. It was like the giant had left me a gift, a piece of the strength he'd built into those creatures in the cavern. More importantly, I started believing my grandmother's stories. All of them. I became the unofficial liaison between the Park Service and the local tribes, helping to protect sacred sites and traditional gathering places. When tourists asked about Miwok legends, I told them the stories were important and should be respected. When young rangers made jokes about Indian superstitions, I set them straight. Because I knew now that some of those legends were warnings and some were instructions, and all of them were true in ways that mattered. But the most important change was in how I saw my job. I wasn't just protecting people from the mountains anymore. I was protecting the mountains from people, and sometimes protecting people from things in the mountains that were older and stranger and more powerful than anything in the ranger manual. Over the years, I started getting reports from other parks. Strange arrangements of bones found in remote areas. Hikers who went missing in places where no one should be able to get lost. Rock formations that looked almost like they'd been built rather than carved by wind and water. Each time, I'd make some calls, talk to the local rangers, share what I knew about reading the signs. Sometimes I'd drive out and take a look myself, bringing along tobacco and sage and the songs my grandmother had taught me. Because the giant in Devil's Canyon hadn't been the only one. There were others, scattered across the wild places of America, each one a guardian spirit that had chosen to stay behind when their people were forced to leave. Each one still building, still waiting, still hoping to bring the dead home. Most of them just needed someone to sing them across the bridge they'd built in their hearts. But some of them were still angry. And every few years when I'd get a call about missing hikers in places where the old stories warned people not to go, I'd pack my gear and head out into the wilderness to do the job my grandmother had really trained me for. The job of helping lost spirits find their way home before they decided to take someone else with them. My name is Michael Stonecrow, and I've been a park ranger for 39 years now. That's long enough to know that some dangers can't be marked on any map, and some rescues require more than ropes and medical training. It's also long enough to know that every story your grandmother told you was probably true. You just have to know how to listen. My name is James Hartwell, and I've been a park ranger on the Buffalo National River for 11 years. I know every bend, every sandbar, every hidden channel in these 50 miles of Arkansas waterways. I grew up in the swamps down south, so I thought I'd heard every tall tale and monster story there was. The old-timers around here love to talk about the Fook monster, some giant creature that's been protecting this river since Civil War times. I always just smiled and nodded. After all, I'd rescued 31 people from drowning in these waters, pulled boats off sandbars in the dead of night, and never saw anything scarier than a black bear. That was before last Tuesday. The summer of '71 hit us hard with the worst drought in memory. Water levels dropped so low that hidden channels I'd never seen before started showing up. Mudflats stretched out like moonscapes, and the cypress trees stood in water barely up to their roots. The whole river system looked different, like the drought was revealing secrets the water had been keeping. I was 34 then, not some green kid who jumps at shadows. My specialty was river patrol. I could navigate these waters in complete darkness just by listening to how the current moved. Every morning, I'd fire up my patrol boat and check the campsites, help lost canoeists, make sure nobody was dumping trash in our pristine waters. It was good work, important work. These waters were special. The Buffalo River runs through some of the most beautiful country in Arkansas. Dense bottomland forest stretches for miles on both sides, with sloughs and backwaters creating a maze that could lose you for days if you didn't know what you were doing. During high water, those channels connect and flow together. But in the drought, they became isolated pockets, cut off from the main river. That's where I found them. 3 experienced canoeists from Lee. Battle Rock had gone missing on Sunday. They knew the river well, had paddled it dozens of times. When they didn't show up at the takeout point Monday evening, their families called us. Standard search and rescue. I'd done it plenty of times before. But nothing about this was standard. I found their canoe first, wedged upright between 2 trees about a mile downstream from where they'd put in. No damage to the boat, paddles still clipped inside. Their gear was there too. Dry bags sealed tight, nothing missing. It looked like they'd just stepped out for a minute. Then I found the bodies. Tommy Jenkins was 40 feet up in an oak tree, sitting peacefully against the trunk, like he'd climbed up there to enjoy the view. No scratches on him, no broken bones, clothes barely wrinkled. Just dead, with that look people get when they've seen something their mind can't handle. Sarah and Mike Henderson were in separate trees about 50 yards apart, positioned the same way. Gently placed, not thrown, no signs of violence, no animal bites. The medical examiner would later say their hearts just stopped. But here's what bothered me. Those trees were surrounded by mudflats. No water underneath them for weeks. Even if someone had climbed up there during high water season, they would have had to swim through rushing current and somehow climb wet bark in the dark. These people died on Sunday, in broad daylight, in the middle of a drought. Standing there looking up at Tommy Jenkins, I felt something I'd never felt before on my river. Like I was being watched by something that didn't want me there. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the cypress grove. I needed to get back to the boat, call in the recovery team, fill out paperwork. But I kept looking around, trying to figure out how 3 healthy adults ended up dead in trees with no way to get there. That's when I saw prints. The footprints were in a dried mud bank about 20 yards from where I'd found the bodies. At first, I thought they might be bear tracks. We had plenty of black bears in the area. But bears don't walk upright for more than a few steps, and these prints went on for 30 feet in a straight line toward the water. They were huge, 20 inches long, maybe 8 inches wide, with distinct toe marks. The depth of them told me whatever made those tracks weighed at least 800 pounds. But the spacing between them, that's what made my skin crawl. The stride was at least 6 feet long. I'm 6'2", and I couldn't match that distance even jumping. I took pictures with my Polaroid camera, measured everything carefully. 11 years on this river, and I'd never seen anything like it. The tracks led right to the water's edge and disappeared. Whatever made them had waded into the Buffalo River like it was a sidewalk. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those 3 people sitting peacefully in those trees, dead for no reason anyone could explain, and those massive footprints. I'd grown up hearing stories about the Boggy Creek Monster, but this was different. This felt real. The next morning I was back on the water early. I told my supervisor I wanted to do a complete patrol of the area, check for any other missing persons or unusual activity. What I really wanted was to understand what had happened to those canoeists. The river was so low, I could see things that were usually underwater. Old car parts from decades ago, pieces of docks that had broken loose during floods, even some rusted farming equipment from when this land was cleared for cotton. But I also started noticing other things, arrangements of sticks and stones that looked almost deliberate, like someone had been making patterns. Around noon, my boat motor died. I'd been running that same Johnson outboard for 3 years without a problem. Regular maintenance, good fuel, never gave me trouble. But as I approached a narrow channel between 2 islands, it just topped. Not sputtering, not running rough, just dead quiet like someone had flipped a switch. I tried the pull cord maybe 20 times. Nothing. Then I noticed my compass spinning like a top, the needle whirling around without stopping. That's when the smell hit me. It was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Wet fur, rotting vegetation, something wild and old and angry. So strong it made my eyes water. I looked around for the source, maybe a dead deer or cattle that had gotten stuck in the mud, but saw nothing. The smell seemed to be coming from downstream, where the channel curved around a stand of cypress trees. I got out my paddle and started working toward shore. That's when I heard the sound. It started low, like a bull gator's mating call, but deeper. Much deeper. Then it rose to almost a howl before dropping back down to a rumble I could feel in my chest. It was coming from the trees ahead, and it was definitely not an alligator. I've heard every animal sound these swamps can make. Bobcats screaming, bears huffing, wild hogs grunting and fighting. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise. No birds, no insects, no water lapping against my boat. Even the wind seemed to have died. It was like the whole swamp was holding its breath. I paddled as quietly as I could toward shore, planning to drag my boat up on the mudbank and walk back to the ranger station. But as I got closer to the trees, I saw something that made me freeze. There was someone standing in the shadows between the cypress trunks, someone huge. At first I thought it might be a person in dark clothing, maybe a fisherman who'd gotten turned around in the maze of channels. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized what I was looking at was impossible. The figure was at least 10 feet tall and covered in dark roan hair. It stood perfectly still, watching me. We looked at each other across maybe 50 feet of shallow water. I couldn't see its face clearly in the shadows, but I could tell it was studying me, trying to decide what to do. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the paddle. Then it moved. I've never seen anything that large move so quietly. It stepped sideways behind a tree, and by the time I paddled over to get a better look, it was gone. No sound of breaking branches, no splash of water, nothing. Like it had just melted back into the swamp. My motor started on the first pull. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Who would believe it? A 10-foot hairy monster in the Buffalo River? I'd have been reassigned to desk duty or sent for psychological evaluation. Instead, I started paying attention to things I'd ignored before. The destroyed campsites, for instance. Over the next week, I found 3 separate camps that had been systematically demolished, not vandalized by teenagers or torn up by bears, methodically taken apart. Tents folded and stacked, gear arranged in neat piles, fire rings carefully dismantled stone by stone. Like someone was sending a message. You're not welcome here. Local fishermen started coming to me with stories. They'd been seeing a walking tree moving through the swamp at dawn. They'd fish for hours without getting a bite, feeling like something was watching them from the forest. Boat motors would die in certain areas, compasses would spin, and that terrible smell would drift over the water. Most disturbing were the sounds. Several people reported hearing voices calling to them from deep in the swamp. Voices that sounded exactly like their friends or family members, trying to lure them away from the safety of the main channel. When they'd follow the voices, they'd end up lost in the maze of backwaters with no idea how they'd gotten there. I started mapping the incidents, marking each strange occurrence on a chart of the river system. A clear pattern emerged. Everything was happening within a 5-mile radius of where I'd found those 3 bodies. Something was claiming territory, and it was getting more aggressive about defending it. Then the Sawyer family went missing. Bob Sawyer and his 2 teenage sons had put in at Buffalo Point on Saturday morning. They were experienced canoeists, knew the river well. When they didn't show up at their takeout point Sunday evening, their wife and mother called in frantic. We launched a full search and rescue operation. I found their canoe on Monday, overturned in a backwater slough. This time there was damage, long gouges in the aluminum hull that looked like claw marks. The boys' life jackets were shredded, and there was blood on the seats. We searched for 3 days with helicopters, dive teams, and volunteers walking the banks. On Wednesday evening, we found them. All 3 were positioned in trees again, but this time they weren't sitting peacefully. Bob Sawyer was hanging upside down from a branch 30 feet up, suspended by his ankles with what looked like vines. His sons were in nearby trees, arranged in sitting positions with their arms crossed over their chests. The medical examiner was baffled. No broken bones, no signs of struggle, but all 3 had died of massive heart failure, just like the first 3 victims. But the positioning was different, more aggressive, more like a warning. That night, I decided to go back out on the water. I knew it was dangerous, probably stupid. But 6 people were dead, and whatever was killing them was getting bolder. As a ranger, it was my job to protect people who came to enjoy our river. I couldn't do that if I didn't understand what we were dealing with. I took my personal boat instead of the patrol craft, a small aluminum John boat with a quiet electric motor. I wanted to move through the area without making noise, maybe get close enough to see what was really happening out there. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light on the water. I knew these channels so well I could navigate them blindfolded, but everything looked different in the moonlight. The drought had revealed new islands and sandbars, changing the familiar landscape into something alien. I was moving slowly through the area where I'd first seen the creature when my electric motor died. Not the battery, the motor just stopped turning. I drifted quietly with the current, listening to the night sounds of the swamp. Somewhere ahead of me, something large was moving through the water. I could hear it walking. The splash of massive feet stepping from the shallows onto mudflats, then back into deeper water. It was following the channel, moving in the same direction as my drifting boat, following me. I grabbed my paddle and tried to change course, but the current kept pushing me downstream toward whatever was ahead. The footsteps got closer, and that smell rolled over the water like a physical thing. My flashlight flickered and went out, leaving me in moonlight and shadow. That's when I heard it speak. It wasn't words exactly, but it was communication. A series of low rumbles and higher-pitched calls that seemed to have pattern and meaning, like it was talking to something else, reporting my position. The sounds came from both sides of the channel now. There was more than one. My boat scraped bottom on a sandbar, stranding me in the middle of the channel. The water was only knee-deep, but I was 2 miles from the nearest road with things moving in the darkness around me. Things that had killed 6 people and arranged their bodies in trees like trophies. I was trapped. The sounds stopped. The silence stretched out until I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, from maybe 20 feet away, came a sound I'll never forget. It was breathing. Deep, slow, deliberate. Something very large was standing in the water nearby, watching me. I whispered a prayer and clicked on my backup flashlight. 2 eyes reflected the light back at me from about 8 feet off. The water. They were intelligent eyes, curious rather than hostile. We stared at each other for what felt like forever. Then the creature made a sound, not threatening, almost questioning, like it was trying to understand what I was doing in its territory. Slowly, carefully, I raised one hand and spoke as calmly as I could. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to understand." The creature tilted its head, listening. Then it stepped closer, and I got my first clear look at what had been killing people in my river. It stood nearly 10 feet tall in the shallow water, covered in thick, dark brown hair that shed moisture like a duck's feathers. Its face was more human than ape, with intelligent brown eyes and a mouth that seemed capable of complex expressions. Massive arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands that could easily palm a basketball. It was magnificent and terrifying at the same time. But what struck me most was how it moved. This creature knew every inch of these waterways better than I did. It stepped carefully around submerged logs I couldn't see, avoided quicksand bogs that would have trapped a human, and moved through the maze of channels like it had been living here for decades. We studied each other in the moonlight. I could see now that this wasn't some mindless monster. There was intelligence in those eyes, even sadness. It made that questioning sound again, and I realized it was trying to communicate. "You've been protecting this river," I said quietly. "Haven't you?" The creature's head tilted again. It understood me. I was certain of it. "Those people who died, they weren't just tourists, were they?" It moved closer, water barely rippling around its massive legs. Now I could see scars on its arms and chest, old wounds that looked like they'd come from machinery. Someone had hurt this creature before. That's when I heard the boat motors. Thurum. High-powered engines were coming fast down the main channel, their lights sweeping the water. The creature heard them too, and immediately became agitated, making low warning sounds and looking toward the approaching noise. "Jimmy, you out there?" It was Earl Dixon's voice. Earl ran a waste management company out of Harrison, though everyone knew he made most of his money dumping industrial chemicals where they shouldn't be dumped. He must have seen my truck parked at the boat ramp. The creature looked at me, then toward the approaching boats, then back at me. In that moment, I understood everything. Those 6 people hadn't been random victims. The Hendersons worked for the Army Corps of Engineers. They'd been doing water quality testing. The Sawyers ran a fishing guide service and had been asking questions about why the fish populations were dropping. Tommy Jenkins was a freelance photographer who'd been documenting illegal dumping sites for the Arkansas Gazette, They'd all been getting too close to something Earl Dixon didn't want exposed, and this creature had been trying to stop them in the only way it knew how, by scaring them away from areas where industrial waste was being dumped into the river system. But it had killed them instead. "I know you were trying to protect the river," I whispered to the creature, "but killing people won't stop them." The boat engines were getting closer. Earl's spotlight swept across the water maybe 100 yards away. The creature looked toward the lights, then back at me, and made a decision. It reached out one massive hand toward my boat. For a second, I thought it was going to crush me like it had the others. Instead, it gently pushed my John boat off the sandbar and pointed downstream toward a hidden channel I'd never noticed before. "Follow," it said. The word was rough, like vocal cords not designed for human speech, but it was definitely English. This creature could talk. I started my electric motor, somehow it worked fine now, and followed the creature downstream into a narrow channel barely width, enough for my boat. Behind us, Earl's boats were searching the main waterway with spotlights and calling my name. The channel opened into a hidden slough surrounded by cypress trees. The creature waded to shore and gestured for me to follow. I beached my boat and walked up onto a mud bank that stretched back into the forest. What I saw there made me understand why 6 people had died. Dozens of chemical drums were half buried in the mud, their contents leaking into the groundwater that fed the Buffalo River. Industrial waste, pesticides, heavy metals, enough poison to kill everything downstream for miles. This was Earl Dixon's real operation, and he'd been using the drought to bury his drums in areas that would be underwater when the rains returned. The creature pointed at the barrels, then at the water, then made a gesture I interpreted as death. It knew the chemicals were killing the river, but it didn't know how to stop the people who were dumping them, so it had tried to scare them away. When that didn't work, it had killed them to protect its home. "We can stop this together," I told it, "but we have to do it right." The sound of boat engines was getting closer. Earl had found the entrance to our hidden channel. The creature looked at me with those intelligent brown eyes and nodded. Then it moved toward the water with surprising speed, disappearing beneath the surface just as Earl's boats rounded the bend. "There you are," Earl called out, his spotlight blazing across my boat. "We've been looking for you everywhere. Heard you might be in trouble." 2 other boats flanked him, carrying men I didn't recognize. They had the look of people who solved problems with violence. "Just doing a night patrol," I called back. "Everything's fine." "That's good to hear," Earl said, but his voice had a threatening edge. "Been some strange things happening out here lately. Folks getting hurt. Might be dangerous for a ranger to be out here alone at night." One of his men was already tying off to my boat. They weren't planning to let me leave. That's when the water exploded. The creature came up from the deep water like a submarine launching a missile, grabbing Earl's boat and flipping it in one smooth motion. Earl and his pilot disappeared underwater with screams cut short by the splash. The other 2 boats tried to run, but the creature was faster in the water than they were on top of it. I watched in amazement as it systematically disabled both motors, crushing the lower units in its massive hands. The boats drifted helplessly as their occupants bailed water and shouted in panic. "Don't hurt them," I called out. "We need them alive." The creature surfaced near my boat, water streaming from its hair. It looked at Earl struggling to stay afloat and made what I can only describe as a disgusted sound. Then it dove again and came up with Earl in one hand, depositing him on the mudbank like a caught fish. The other men were swimming for shore, their boats sinking fast. The creature herded them onto the mudbank like a sheepdog working cattle, keeping them grouped together while I called for backup on my radio. "This is Ranger Hartwell requesting immediate assistance at the chemical dump site in Sector 7. Multiple arrests needed for illegal dumping and conspiracy." I'd found my evidence, and I had witnesses. The creature had given me everything I needed to shut down Earl's operation and clean up the river. 2 hours later, the area was swarming with Arkansas State Police, EPA investigators, and hazmat teams. Earl and his men were in custody, and the cleanup operation was already being planned. It would take months to remove all the contaminated soil and neutralize the chemicals, but the Buffalo River would survive. The creature was long gone by the time the cavalry arrived. I never saw it again, though sometimes on quiet nights I'd hear that questioning call from deep in the swamp. And the illegal dumping stopped completely. It got around that the Buffalo River was protected by something that didn't negotiate. I got promoted to Chief Ranger 6 months later, credited with breaking up the biggest illegal dumping operation in Arkansas history. The river gradually returned to health as the chemicals were cleaned up and the fish populations recovered. I trained my replacement rangers to watch for signs of environmental crime, though I never mentioned what I'd really learned out there in the dark water. The official report listed those 6 deaths as accidental drowning incidents complicated by heart failure due to extreme stress. The families got closure, Earl Dixon got 20 years in federal prison, and the Buffalo National River got protection that goes deeper than any law Congress could pass. Sometimes tourists ask me about the Fook monster stories. I tell them the same thing I told people before that night in the swamp. Arkansas has a lot of wildlife, and the river holds secrets we may never fully understand. But I sleep better now, knowing that something out there is watching over these waters. Something that understands the difference between people who come to enjoy the river and people who come to destroy it. The drought ended in September with 3 weeks of steady rain. Water levels returned to normal, hiding the chemical dump site under 20 feet of clean river water. The mud banks where I'd seen those massive footprints disappeared beneath the current. But on still mornings when I'm out on early patrol, I sometimes catch a whiff of that wild, ancient smell. And I know I'm not alone on the river. I'm just the day shift. The river has its own night watchman now, and it doesn't need a badge to do its job. My name is James Hartwell, and I've been protecting the Buffalo National River for 15 years now. But I learned that night that I was never really protecting it alone. Some things are bigger than one man, deeper than any law, older than any government. Some things just are, and that's enough. My name is Daniel Hayes, and I've been a park ranger for 8 years. I inspect bridges for a living, checking cables, looking for cracks, making sure people don't fall to their deaths. It's not exciting work, but it matters. Before this job, I studied engineering. I believe in math, science, and things you can measure. I never believed in monsters. The new River Gorge Bridge in West Virginia is my main responsibility. It's 876 feet high, almost as tall as 3 football fields stacked on top of each other. When you stand on it, the river below looks like a thin blue ribbon. On foggy days, you can't see the bottom at all. October is the worst month. The fog rolls up from the river every morning, thick as cotton. Tourists love it because it looks mysterious. I hate it because I can't see what I'm doing. But the bridge still needs checking, fog or no fog. People around here tell stories. They say there's something living in the gorge, a creature with huge wings that shows up before bad things happen. They call it the Mothman. According to the stories, it appeared before a bridge collapsed in Ohio back in the 1960s. 46 people died when that bridge fell into the river. I always laughed at those stories. Flying monsters, please. I deal with real problems: rust, metal fatigue, stress fractures, things that can actually hurt people. The bridge gets about 16,000 cars every day. During tourist season, it's even more. Families drive across taking pictures. Kids press their faces against car windows, amazed by how high they are. Old couples hold hands walking across the pedestrian walkway, all of them trusting that this giant piece of steel will hold them up. That's my job, making sure it does. I live alone in a small house near the park headquarters. My ex-wife said I cared more about bridges than people. Maybe she was right. But bridges don't lie to you. They don't leave you. They just do their job day after day until they can't anymore. Then they tell you through cracks and rust spots and stress readings. You just have to know how to listen. Every morning, I drive to the bridge with my equipment: electronic sensors that measure how much the bridge bends, ultrasonic devices that find hidden cracks, a computer that records everything. The bridge talks to me through these machines, tells me how it's feeling. October 15th started like any other day. Heavy fog, cool air, the sound of cars driving slowly across the bridge because drivers couldn't see far ahead. I parked my truck at the south end and got out my gear. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Usually, the gorge echoes with sound. Cars, wind, the river below. But that morning everything felt muffled. Even my footsteps sounded different on the steel walkway. I started my inspection at the south tower. The bridge has 2 towers, one on each end, connected by cables and the roadway. I'd done this walk hundreds of times. Hook up the sensors, check the readings, move to the next section. Simple. But the readings weren't normal. The sensors showed the bridge was flexing, bending back and forth like something heavy was walking on it. But I could see the traffic. Just regular cars and trucks, nothing unusual. The math didn't add up. I rechecked my equipment. Everything looked fine. I tried again. Same results. The bridge was moving like it had never moved before. That's when I heard the first sound. A low whooshing noise like giant wings beating the air. I looked up, but the fog was too thick. I couldn't see anything above the bridge cables. Something was wrong. I just didn't know what yet. The whooshing sound came again, closer this time. I stopped walking and listened hard. Wind through the cables makes a whistling noise. This was different, deeper, more regular, like breathing. My equipment started acting up. The electronic sensors flickered and went dead. My computer screen showed static. I hit the side of it, but nothing changed. In 8 years, I'd never had all my equipment fail at once. I kept walking toward the center of the bridge. Without the sensors, I had to rely on my eyes. I looked for rust spots, loose bolts, anything that might explain the weird readings. Halfway across, I found something that made my blood turn cold. There were marks on the steel, not scratches or rust. Actual gouges, like something with huge claws had grabbed the bridge. The marks were fresh, cutting through the paint down to bare metal. They were arranged in sets of 4, each gouge about as long as my hand. I measured them. The span between the marks was nearly 3 feet. What kind of animal has claws that big? As I bent down to get a closer look, a shadow passed over me. I looked up fast, but saw nothing except fog. The shadow had been huge, bigger than any bird I knew. My radio crackled with static. I tried to call headquarters, but got only noise. All my communication was down. I was alone on the bridge with whatever had made those marks. That's when I saw the eyes. 2 red dots floating in the fog above me, maybe 30 feet up. They didn't blink. They just watched. I stared back, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The fog shifted, and for a second I saw something impossible. Wings. Massive black wings that stretched wider than the bridge was tall. A body like a man, but larger, more muscular. And those eyes, glowing like hot coals, staring right at me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my equipment bag. When I looked up again, it was gone. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was the fog playing tricks, maybe a helicopter with strange lights. There had to be a logical explanation, but deep down, I knew better. I'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. I finished my inspection as fast as possible, checking only the most critical areas. The claw marks were everywhere, on the towers, the cables, even the roadway itself. Whatever this thing was, it had been all over the bridge. Back at headquarters, I tried to write my report. How do you explain claw marks from a creature that doesn't exist? How do you tell your boss that a flying monster is messing with your bridge? I wrote about equipment failure and recommended a full structural analysis. I didn't mention the eyes or the wings. I wanted to keep my job. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those eyes, the way they seemed to look right through me. I researched Mothman sightings online. Most were just stories, but some included details that matched what I'd seen. The wingspan, the glowing eyes, the way it appeared near bridges. One article made my stomach drop. It was about the Silver Bridge collapse in Point Pleasant, Ohio in 1967. Dozens of people had reported seeing a large, winged creature in the weeks before the bridge fell. The creature had red, glowing eyes and left strange marks on the bridge structure. 46 people died when that bridge collapsed. I looked at photos of the wreckage. Cars crushed in the river, families destroyed, a community shattered. The bridge had been inspected just months before and declared safe. I thought about the claw marks on our bridge, the impossible stress readings, the equipment failure. Was the same thing happening here? The next morning I drove to the bridge earlier than usual. The fog was even thicker, but I had to know. I had to see if the creature was still there. I didn't have to wait long. As soon as I stepped onto the walkway, my equipment died again. Complete electrical failure, like something was jamming all the signals. I kept walking anyway, using just my eyes and hands to check the bridge. The whooshing sound started when I reached the center span. This time, I was ready for it. I looked up and saw the creature clearly. It was perched on the north tower, wings folded against its body. In daylight, it was even more terrifying. The body was humanoid, but wrong. Too tall, too muscular, covered in dark fur or feathers. The wings were enormous, with a span that had to be at least 15 feet. But it was the eyes that scared me most. They weren't just glowing, they were intelligent. This thing was watching me, studying me, like it was trying to decide something important. We stared at each other for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, the creature spread its wings and took off. It circled the bridge once, those red eyes never leaving me, then disappeared into the fog. I found more claw marks that day, fresh ones. The creature wasn't just visiting the bridge, it was working on it, touching it, changing it somehow. And my stress sensors, when they briefly worked, showed the bridge was getting weaker. Over the next week, the creature appeared every time I came to the bridge. It seemed to be waiting for me. At first, I was terrified. Then I became curious. The thing never attacked me, never even came close. It just watched. I started keeping a notebook. When the creature appeared, where it perched, how long it stayed. I began to see patterns. The creature only showed up when my equipment detected structural problems. If a section of the bridge was stressed or damaged, the creature would be there first, perched right on top of the problem area. It was like it could see things I couldn't. My equipment worked better when the creature wasn't around, so I learned its schedule. Early morning visits were safe. The creature usually appeared around 10 a.m. and left by noon. Afternoon inspections were impossible. Complete electrical failure every time. But even when my equipment worked, the readings were getting worse. The bridge was developing micro-fractures in places that should have been strong. The stress patterns made no sense from an engineering perspective. It was like the bridge was aging 10 times faster than normal. I tried to report this to my supervisor, but without working. Equipment during the creature's visits, I had no proof, just stories about electronic failures and my own observations. "Equipment breaks," my boss said. "Get it fixed and do your job." But I knew it wasn't just equipment failure. The creature's presence was somehow interfering with electronics. Cars passing by during its visits had their radios cut out. Cell phones stopped working. Even digital watches would freeze. I started researching electromagnetic fields. Some animals, like sharks and dolphins, can sense electrical fields. Maybe this creature generated some kind of electromagnetic pulse. Then I had a crazy idea. What if the creature was trying to tell me something? I went back to the bridge with an analog compass, the old-fashioned kind that doesn't use electronics. When the creature appeared, the needle spun wildly, pointing in different directions. But it wasn't random. The compass was pointing to specific spots on the bridge. I checked those spots later, when the creature was gone. Every single one had structural problems: cracks, corrosion, metal fatigue. Problems my regular inspections had missed. The creature wasn't damaging the bridge. It was showing me what was already wrong. But why? What did it want? I thought about the Silver Bridge collapse, the Mothman sightings before the disaster. What if the creature hadn't caused the collapse? What if it had been trying to prevent it? The idea seemed insane, but the evidence was mounting. The creature appeared at problem spots. It interfered with electronics, but only near areas that needed attention. It watched me like it was waiting for me to understand something important. I started having dreams. Nightmares, really. I saw the bridge collapsing, cars falling into the gorge, people screaming. In the dreams, I could have prevented it, but I didn't listen to the warnings. When I woke up, the creature would be outside my window, those red eyes staring at me through the glass. The stress readings kept getting worse. According to my calculations, the bridge was approaching critical failure. But the problems were in areas that shouldn't fail, areas that had been fine just weeks before. I requested an emergency inspection from the state engineers. They came out, ran their tests, and found nothing wrong. Their equipment worked fine. They didn't see the creature. "Bridge is solid," the lead engineer told me. "You might want to get your equipment checked, maybe take some time off." They thought I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. I wasn't sleeping well. I jumped at shadows. I kept seeing those glowing eyes everywhere I looked. My ex-wife called, worried because I sounded strange on the phone. But I knew what I was seeing was real. The creature, the structural problems, the electromagnetic interference, it was all connected. I started spending entire days on the bridge. If the creature was trying to warn me about something, I needed to understand what. I mapped every spot where it appeared, every area where the compass spun, every location with stress problems. A pattern emerged. The creature was most active near the center span, the part of the bridge that would cause the most deaths if it failed. Cars crossed there at highway speeds. If that section collapsed, dozens of vehicles would fall into the gorge. The creature knew this. It was trying to tell me the bridge was going to fail, and soon. On October 28th, the creature's behavior changed. Instead of just watching, it started making sounds. Deep, rumbling calls that echoed through the gorge. It spread its wings wider, flew in tight circles around the bridge towers. It was agitated, urgent. Something was wrong. I checked and rechecked the bridge. The stress readings were off the charts. According to my instruments, the bridge should have collapsed already. But it was still standing, still carrying traffic. Then I realized what was happening. The creature wasn't just warning me about the bridge failure. It was showing me when it would happen. Tourist season was about to start. In 2 days, the annual Bridge Day Festival would bring 100,000 visitors to the area. Thousands of people would be on or near the bridge. If it collapsed then, the death toll would be enormous. I had to do something. But who would believe me? A park ranger claiming a flying monster was predicting a bridge collapse? I'd be fired, maybe committed. But if I did nothing, and the bridge fell during the festival, hundreds of people would die. The creature perched on the north tower and stared at me. Those red eyes seemed to be asking a question. What are you going to do? October 30th. Bridge Day was tomorrow. I hadn't slept in 2 days. The creature was appearing constantly now, circling the bridge, calling out warnings that only I seemed to understand. I tried one more time to convince my supervisor. I showed him my stress readings, my photos of the claw marks, my documentation of the electromagnetic interference. "Hayes, you're talking about canceling Bridge Day because of a bird," he said. "Do you know how much money this festival brings in? How many people are already here?" "It's not a bird," I said. "And the bridge is going to collapse." He stared at me for a long moment. "I think you need to go home. Take a few days off. Get some rest." "You don't understand. I understand that you're having some kind of breakdown. Don't make me write you up." I left his office knowing I was on my own. The creature was still out there, still trying to warn people who wouldn't listen, just like before the Silver Bridge collapse. That night, I sat on the bridge in the dark. The creature appeared immediately, landing on the railing just 20 feet away. This close, I could see details I'd missed before. The intelligence in its eyes, the almost human-like features of its face, the way its head tilted as it watched me. "Atsi, you know it's going to happen, don't you?" I said out loud. "You've seen it before." The creature made a low, rumbling sound. Not threatening, almost sad. "How many times have you tried to warn people? How many times have they not listened?" It spread its wings slightly, and I saw something that made my heart race. The wings were scarred, marked with old injuries. This creature had been through battles, had suffered trying to prevent disasters. "I believe you," I whispered, "but I don't know how to stop it." The creature stood up on the railing, towering over me. Then it did something incredible. It pointed. One long, clawed finger extended toward the center of the bridge, then swept down toward the gorge below. It was showing me exactly where the bridge would fail. I understood then. The creature couldn't prevent the disaster itself. It could only warn. The choice was mine. I spent the rest of the night on the bridge, checking and rechecking the area where the creature had pointed. My equipment worked in brief spurts, giving me glimpses of catastrophic stress readings. The metal was failing at the molecular level, weakening in ways that normal inspections couldn't detect. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. At 6 a.m., I called in a bomb threat. "There's a device on the New River Gorge Bridge," I told the 911 operator, disguising my voice. "You need to close it immediately." Within minutes, police cars were racing toward the bridge. They evacuated the area, set up roadblocks, called in the bomb squad. Bridge day was canceled. I watched from a distance as hundreds of people were turned away. Angry tourists, frustrated vendors, disappointed families. They had no idea I might have saved their lives. The bomb squad searched the bridge for hours. They found nothing, of course. But while they searched, I watched the creature. It perched calmly on the north tower, no longer agitated. The urgent calling had stopped. Around 2 p.m., just when the festival would have been at its peak, I heard a sound I'll never forget, a deep metallic groan that seemed to come from the bridge itself. The center span sagged, just an inch or two, but enough to see from the shore. Cars that would have been crossing at that moment would have felt the bridge buckle beneath them. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, everything went quiet. The groaning stopped. The bridge straightened. The creature looked at me one last time, then spread its wings and flew away into the gorge. Later investigation showed that a crucial support cable had developed a hairline crack. Not enough to cause immediate collapse, but enough to create dangerous instability under the weight of festival crowds. The crack was in exactly the spot the creature had pointed to. Officials praised the anonymous bomb threat that had saved lives. I was questioned like everyone else, but my disguised voice and careful timing kept suspicion away. The bridge was repaired and reopened a week later. I returned to my normal inspection routine. My equipment worked fine now, giving normal readings. The stress patterns made sense again. The creature was gone. But sometimes, in the early morning fog, I thought I could see a shadow circling high above the gorge, watching, waiting for the next warning that needed to be given. That was 5 years ago. I'm still a bridge inspector, but my job has changed. Word got out somehow about my special ability to spot structural problems before they become critical. I've been called to inspect bridges all over the country. Bridges where other inspectors found nothing wrong, but officials were worried anyway. I don't advertise what I really do. I can't put "communicates with prophetic flying creatures" on my resume, but I've learned to watch for the signs. Electromagnetic interference that doesn't make sense. Animals acting strange. Equipment failures and patterns that seem almost intentional. And sometimes, just sometimes, I see glowing eyes in the shadows. T, the creature. I never did find out if it was the same one from the old stories or something else entirely. Showed up 3 more times over the years. Once at a bridge in Montana, where I found stress fractures that could have killed a school bus full of children. Once in Florida, where hurricane damage was worse than anyone realized. And once in my home state, where an old railroad bridge was about to drop a freight train into a river. Each time, I managed to find a reason to close the bridge. Equipment malfunction, gas leak, suspicious activity, whatever excuse would work. Each time the bridge failed shortly after, but with no one on it. I never saw the creature up close again. It would appear just long enough for me to spot the problem, then disappear, like it knew I understood now. The official reports credit improved inspection techniques and better equipment. The bridge safety community considers me some kind of genius for spotting problems others miss. I've won awards, been featured in engineering journals, even consulted on bridge design projects. None of them know the truth. Sometimes I wonder if there are others like me. People who've learned to listen to warnings that come from impossible sources. People who've seen things they can't explain, but choose to act anyway. I keep a photo on my desk from Bridge Day, taken just before I called in the bomb threat. If you look carefully at the background, you can see a dark shape perched on the north tower. Most people think it's a defect in the film. I know better. The New River Gorge Bridge still stands, carrying thousands of cars every day. Families cross it on vacation. Kids press their faces to car windows. Old couples hold hands walking across the pedestrian walkway. They all trust that this giant piece of steel will hold them up. It will. I make sure of it. And somewhere out there, in the fog and shadows above bridges across the country, red eyes are still watching. Still waiting to warn anyone willing to listen. The Mothman isn't a monster. It's a guardian angel with wings. You just have to know how to see it. My name is Patricia Drummond, and I've been a park ranger for 13 years. Most people call me Patty. I work in the North Cascades up in Washington State, where the mountains get so tall they scrape the clouds. Winter up here isn't like winter anywhere else. It's mean, it's hungry, and sometimes it makes things happen that shouldn't be possible. I became a ranger after my brother Tommy died in an avalanche. He was only 19, just a kid who loved to ski. The mountain took him, and I guess I thought if I learned everything I could about these peaks, maybe I could save someone else's brother. Maybe I could make sense of it all. February is the worst month. The snow piles up 12 feet deep, and the wind howls through the valleys like something in pain. When a blizzard hits, you can't see your hand in front of your face. The cold gets so bad it hurts to breathe. We call it the hungry season because everything up here is just trying to survive until spring. The radio crackled to life at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. I was drinking coffee in my cabin, watching the snow fall outside my window. It had been coming down for 3 days straight. "Patty, we got a problem," said my boss, Jim Morrison. Not the singer, just a guy with the worst luck in names. "The research station at Cascade Pass has gone quiet. No radio contact for 4 days." I knew that station. 5 scientists studying snow patterns and climate change. They had enough food and fuel for 3 months, plus emergency supplies. These weren't city folks who didn't know a snowflake from a snow shovel. They were smart people who knew the mountains. "Could be their radio died," I said. But even as I said it, something felt wrong. They had backup radios. They had satellite phones. They had ways to call for help. "We dropped supplies yesterday," Jim continued. "Pilot said the station looked normal from the air. SEM. Okay from the chimney, lights on. But nobody answered our calls." I stared out at the swirling snow. Cascade Pass was 15 miles from my cabin, all uphill, through some of the most dangerous terrain in the park. In good weather, it was a 6-hour hike. In this blizzard, it could take 2 days, if I could make it at all. "You want me to go check on them?" "Weather Service says this storm will break tomorrow morning. You could head out then." I thought about those 5 people up there. Maybe they were fine. Maybe they were just having equipment problems. But maybe they weren't. Maybe something had happened and they needed help. That's what I was here for. "I'll go," I said. That night, I packed my gear. Snowshoes, because the drifts were too deep for skis. Emergency food for a week. My .45 pistol, because bears sometimes woke up early from hibernation when they got desperate. Medical supplies, rope. My sleeping bag rated for 40 below zero. Everything I might need to bring 5 people down from the mountain. I'd always figured the old stories about monsters in these mountains were just warnings about what happens when people get too hungry, too cold, too scared. The Skagit tribe told stories about something they called the hunger that walks. Creatures that came during the worst winters, when food ran out and people started looking at each other differently. Just stories, I told myself. People made up monsters to explain the things that were too terrible to understand any other way. I should have listened to those stories. The storm broke just after sunrise, like Jim said it would. The sky turned from black to gray to pale blue, and the wind finally stopped howling. I strapped on my snowshoes and headed up the mountain. The snow was perfect powder, 3 feet deep from the fresh storm. My snowshoes sank, but held, and I found a good rhythm. Step, step, breathe. Saint. Ep, step, breathe. The cold bit at my face, but I was warm enough inside my layers. This was what I was good at. This was home. but something felt wrong from the start. I'd hiked this trail hundreds of times. I knew every tree, every rock, every turn. In winter, it should have been full of animal tracks, rabbits, deer, even the occasional mountain cat. Instead, the snow was blank white as far as I could see. Not one track, not even a bird had landed here. That wasn't natural. Animals knew things we didn't. When they avoided a place, there was usually a good reason. It took me 8 hours to reach the research station. My legs burned and sweat had frozen in my hair despite the cold. But I made it. The station sat in a clearing at 5,400 feet, a cluster of 4 buildings connected by ropes you could follow even in a whiteout. Solar panels, radio antenna, weather station. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Smoke rose from the main building's chimney. Lights glowed in the windows. But no one came out to greet me, even though they must have heard my snowshoes crunching across the clearing. "Hello?" I called. "Anyone home?" Nothing. I knocked on the main door. It wasn't locked. Mountain people rarely locked their doors. Out here, a closed door could mean death to someone seeking shelter. The inside of the station was warm, almost hot. The wood stove was burning bright, fed with fresh logs. Coffee sat in a pot on the electric burner, still warm. Food was laid out on the counter. Bread, canned soup, dried fruit. Enough to feed 5 people. But the place had been torn apart. Chairs were overturned. Drawers hung open with their contents scattered on the floor. Cabinet doors stood wide and empty cans were scattered everywhere. It looked like someone had been frantically searching for food, but food was right there on the counter. I called out again. "Dr. Martinez? Dr. Chen? Anyone?" My voice echoed off the walls and died. I was alone. I found the first strange thing in the kitchen. Bite marks on the wooden table. Deep gouges where someone had chewed on the E. Deej, like an animal might gnaw on a bone. But these were human teeth marks. I was sure of it. The second strange thing was the radio room. All the equipment was working fine. I tested the main radio, the backup radio, even the satellite phone. Everything worked perfectly. So why hadn't they called for help? The logbook sat open on the desk. The last entry was from 4 days ago. Day 47. Still snowing. Team morale good. Food supplies adequate. All equipment functioning normally. Weather forecast shows storm clearing in 2 to 3 days. Dr. J. Martinez, team leader. But something was written below that in different handwriting. The pencil marks were deep, pressed hard into the paper like the writer was angry or desperate. So hungry, can't stop eating. More food, need more food. Always hungry now. I stared at those words. They didn't make sense. The station was full of food. Canned goods, dried supplies, fresh vegetables they'd been growing in their little greenhouse. Why would anyone be hungry? I searched the other buildings. The sleeping quarters showed signs of a fight. Overturned bunks, scattered clothes, a broken window that someone had covered with cardboard. The research lab was a mess of scattered papers and broken equipment. But no people, no bodies, no blood. The tracks outside told a story, but it was a story that didn't make sense. Snowshoe tracks led away from the station in every direction, like people had left at different times, going different ways. Some tracks went in circles, coming back to the station from impossible angles. Others just stopped, ended in the middle of nothing, like whoever was walking had just vanished. As the sun started to set, I made a decision. I'd stay the night in the station and search more in the morning. Maybe the research team had gone down the mountain another way. Maybe they'd taken shelter somewhere else. There had to be a reasonable explanation. I built up the fire and made dinner from their supplies. Canned chili and bread. It tasted good, but I noticed something strange. No matter how much I ate, still felt hungry. Not just a little hungry. Starving, like I hadn't eaten in days. That's when I heard it. A sound like someone's stomach growling. But it was too loud, too deep, and it was coming from outside. I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window. Nothing but snow and darkness. But the sound came again, echoing off the mountains like thunder. Something was out there, something big, something hungry. I didn't sleep much that first night. Every time I dozed off, I'd hear that sound again. that deep, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the walls of the station. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just the wind in the mountains, making noise as it rushed through the valleys. But I was wrong. I found the first body just after sunrise. Dr. Sarah Chen was about 50 yards from the station, half buried in snow near the tree line. I almost walked right past her, but something made me look closer. A splash of red on the white snow. She'd been partially eaten. I've seen bear attacks before. I know what they look like. Bears are messy eaters, and they usually drag their prey to a safe place before feeding. This was different. The bite marks were too clean, too precise. And bears don't usually go for the face first. But the worst part was her expression. Her eyes were still open, staring up at the sky, and she looked hungry. Even in death, she looked like she was starving. I radioed down to Jim immediately. "I found one of them," I said. "She's dead. Looks like an animal attack, but I'm not sure what kind of animal." "Any sign of the others?" I looked around at all those crazy snowshoe tracks. "They scattered. I'm going to follow the tracks, see if I can find them." "Be careful, Patty. If there's a predator up there." "I know. I'll check in every hour." But even as I said it, I knew this wasn't a normal predator. The tracks told a story that made no sense. Some led into the trees and just stopped. Others went in perfect circles like someone had been walking in their sleep. And there were other tracks too. Big ones. Bigger than any animal I knew. I followed the clearest trail, the one that led toward the old ranger cabin about 2 miles north. The snowshoes had been moving fast, whoever was wearing them. Sometimes the tracks showed where they'd fallen and gotten back up. Other times it looked like they'd been running. The trail led me through a grove of pine trees, their branches heavy with snow. It should have been peaceful, beautiful. Instead, it felt like being watched. The hair on the back of my neck kept standing up, and I found myself looking over my shoulder every few steps. That's when I started feeling it. The hunger. It began as just a small, empty feeling in my stomach, even though I'd eaten a big breakfast. But as I walked, it got worse. By the time I reached the old cabin, I was so hungry I could barely think straight. It felt like I hadn't eaten in weeks. The cabin was empty, but someone had been there recently. The door hung open, and snow had blown inside. Canned food was scattered across the floor, all of it opened and eaten. Even the cans were licked clean. I found Dr. Martinez there. He was alive, but barely. Huddled in the corner, shivering despite the thick winter coat he was wearing. When he saw me, his eyes lit up with a hunger I'd never seen in a human being. "Food," he whispered. "Do you have food?" I had energy bars in my pack. I gave him one, and he tore into it like a wild animal, barely chewing before swallowing. When he finished, he looked at me with those same hungry eyes. "More," he said. "I need more." "What happened up here, Dr. Martinez? Where's the rest of your team?" He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "We ate," he said. "We ate everything, but it's never enough. We're always hungry now." "Hungry for what?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something terrible in his eyes. "You know," he said quietly. That's when I heard it again. That deep, rumbling growl. But this time it was closer. Much closer. "It's coming," Dr. Martinez whispered. "It's always coming. Following the hunger." The walls of the cabin shook. Something enormous was moving outside, circling us. Through the broken window, I caught a glimpse of it. It had once been human, but it was huge now, at least 15 feet tall, with arms that reached nearly to the ground. Its skin was gray and stretched tight over bones that jutted out at wrong angles. Its mouth was full of teeth, too many teeth. And when it opened its mouth to roar, I could see all the way down its throat. But the worst part was its eyes. They were human eyes, filled with a hunger so desperate it hurt to look at them. "Wendigo," Dr. Martinez whispered. "It used to be Dr. Patterson, but the hunger took him first, and every time it feeds, it gets bigger." The creature smashed through the cabin wall like it was made of paper. Dr. Martinez screamed, but not in fear. In hunger. He launched himself at the Wendigo, trying to bite it, trying to eat it. even though it was 50 times bigger than him. I ran. I ran through the snow as fast as my snowshoes would carry me, listening to the terrible sounds behind me. The Wendigos' roar, Dr. Martinez's screams, the sound of feeding, and all the while the hunger grew stronger inside me. I could feel it spreading through my body like a disease, making me think about things I'd never thought about before, making me look at the world differently, making me wonder what human meat would taste like. I made it back to the research station, but I wasn't alone. They followed me through the trees, the other researchers, or what was left of them. Dr. Williams walked with a strange, jerky gait, like his joints didn't work right anymore. Dr. Foster crawled on her hands and knees, sniffing the ground like a dog following a scent. They moved wrong, but they were still human enough to use tools, to think, to hunt. They were still human enough to beg. "Please," Dr. Williams called as I barricaded myself inside the main building. "We're so hungry. Just a little taste. Just a finger. You won't even miss it." I knew they weren't lying. The hunger was eating me from the inside, too. I'd already caught myself looking at my own arm, wondering what it would be like to take just a small bite. The pain would be worth it if it made this terrible emptiness go away. But I also knew that one bite wouldn't be enough. It never was, according to the stories. The Wendigo hunger was like a poison that spread through your body, making you need more and more until there was nothing left of the person you used to be. I had to find a way to fight it. The research station had a good library. I found books about Native American folklore, about the legends of the Skagit people who lived in these mountains long before any white settlers arrived. They had stories about the Wendigo going back hundreds of years. According to the legends, the Wendigo was created when people turned to cannibalism during harsh winters. The act of eating human flesh invited a spirit of endless hunger into their bodies. The spirit would grow stronger with each feeding, eventually taking over completely and transforming the host into a monster. But the stories also said the Wendigo could be killed. Fire was the key. The spirit of hunger feared flame above all else, because fire could purify and cleanse. If you could trap a Wendigo and burn it completely, the curse would end. The problem was catching it. The Wendigo, Dr. Patterson's transformed body, was at least 20 feet tall now. I could hear it moving through the forest, breaking trees as it walked. Every few hours it would circle the station, testing the walls, looking for a way in. Its pack of infected humans would cluster a rows. And it, whimpering and begging for food. I had to move fast. The hunger was getting stronger every hour, and I could feel my human thoughts starting to slip away. Soon, I'd be just like them, crawling on the ground and eating anything I could find. I spent the day preparing. I gathered every flammable thing in the station: gasoline for the generator, propane tanks, even bottles of rubbing alcohol from the medical supplies. I rigged up a trap using climbing rope and pulleys, something that could bring the Wendigo down if I could lure it into the right position. As night fell, the pack got bolder. I could see them through the windows, pressing their faces against the glass, leaving smeared handprints as they clawed at the walls. Dr. Williams had found an axe somewhere and was chopping weakly at the front door. He was crying as he did it. "I'm sorry, Patty," he sobbed between axe blows. "I can't stop. It hurts so much to be this hungry." That's when I made my decision. These people were suffering. They'd been turned into monsters, but part of them was still human, still in pain, still aware of what they'd become. I had to end this, one way or another. I opened the door. Dr. Williams stumbled inside, axe raised, but he was weak from hunger and cold. I managed to get the weapon away from him and tie him up with climbing rope. Dr. Foster crawled in after him, and I did the same to her. They begged and pleaded and tried to bite me, but the human part of them was grateful. I could see it in their eyes. "Thank you," Dr. Williams whispered through his tears. "End it, please." The Wendigo came last. It had to crouch down to fit through the doorway, and even then, its antlers scraped against the frame. Up close, I could see traces of Dr. Patterson in its face, the same nose, the same brown eyes. but everything else was wrong. Its skin was stretched tight over a skeleton that had grown too large for its body. Its fingers ended in claws that could tear through metal. Its mouth was full of broken human teeth mixed with fangs. It looked at me with those terrible, dry eyes and spoke in a voice like winter wind. So, hungry. I know, I said. I can help. I led it toward the center of the room where I'd set up my trap. Rope and pulleys attached to the ceiling beams, all of it ready to come down at the pull of a single cord. The Wendigo followed, trusting me because I smelled like prey, like food it could finally eat. When it was in position, I pulled the cord. The ropes came down like a net, tangling around the Wendigo's massive limbs. It roared and thrashed, but the more it struggled, the more tangled it became. I'd used every piece of climbing rope in the station, and it was strong enough to hold a falling climber. It would hold this monster. Then I started pouring gasoline. The Wendigo's roars turned to screams when it smelled the fuel. It knew what was coming. The infected researchers knew too, and they began crying, thanking me, begging me to hurry. "The fire will cleanse us," Dr. Williams said, his voice clear for the first time since I'd found him. "The fire will set us free." I lit the match. The flames caught instantly, spreading across the gasoline-soaked floor faster than I'd expected. I barely made it to the door before the whole room was engulfed. The Wendigo's screams mixed with the roar of the fire, and for a moment, I thought I could hear Dr. Patterson's voice calling out from inside the monster. "Thank you." The station burned for 3 hours. When it was over, nothing remained but ash and charred bones. The Wendigo was dead. The infected researchers were at peace, and the terrible hunger that had been eating me from the inside finally began to fade. But it didn't disappear completely. Even now, 23 years later, I still feel it sometimes. A little empty spot in my stomach that no amount of food can fill. I transferred to desert parks after that winter, places where snow never falls and the temperatures never drop below freezing. I've never worked a winter assignment again. I also started studying Native American folklore seriously, learning about creatures and curses that most people think are just stories. Because they're not just stories. They're warnings, passed down through generations of people who understood that there are some hungers that can never be satisfied. Every winter I check the missing persons reports from mountain regions across the country. And every few years, I find patterns that worry me. Groups of people who disappear during harsh winters. Rescue teams who find empty cabins full of food but no people. Unexplained animal attacks where the bite marks don't match any known predator. The Wendigo curse didn't die in that fire. It never does. It just waits for the next time someone gets hungry enough, desperate enough to cross the line between human and monster. So, if you're ever up in the mountains during a hard winter and you start feeling hungrier than you should, remember this story. Remember that some appetites are too dangerous to feed. And whatever you do, don't go looking for meat that tastes too familiar. Because once you take that first bite, you'll never stop being hungry again. My name is William Cavanaugh, and I've been a ranger at Mammoth Cave for 22 years. I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know what really happened down there. The official reports won't tell you the truth. They can't. People think being a cave ranger is just giving tours and checking tickets. But Mammoth Cave isn't like other parks. We've got over 400 miles of mapped passages, and that's just what we know about. Some chambers go down 379 feet. In the deepest sections, you're so far from sunlight you might as well be on another planet. My grandfather explored these caves back in the 1920s. My father guided tours here in the 50s. Cave dust is literally in my blood. I learned to read limestone like other kids learn to read books. I could tell you which passages flood in spring, which ones stay dry all year, and where to find the hidden chambers that aren't on any tourist map. That's why what happened in November of 1983 shook me so bad. Because I thought I knew every inch of this place. It was late autumn, the kind of cold that makes tourists stay home. Perfect weather for the cave, though. Down below, it's always 54 degrees, whether it's snowing outside or blazing hot. The Cherokee used to call this place sacred. They had stories about stone giants living in the deep chambers, punishing anyone who disturbed the sacred spaces. I never believed those stories. Not until I met one. The trouble started when Dr. Sarah Chen's research team went missing. 5 experienced cavers, all with PhDs in geology or archaeology. They'd been mapping the lower sections near Wild Cave tour route, nothing dangerous. Professional equipment, proper permits, radio check-ins every 2 hours. Then they just vanished. I found their gear on Tuesday morning. Everything was there: ropes, helmets, lights, mapping tools. But it was us, arranged in perfect geometric patterns on the chamber floor. Circles within circles, like some kind of ritual. None of the equipment was damaged. The batteries in their headlamps were still good. Their notebooks were filled out right up until 3:47 p.m. the day before. 5 people don't just disappear from a mapped section of cave, especially not people who knew what they were doing. The weird part was the walls. I'd been in that chamber maybe 50 times over the years. The limestone formations were as familiar to me as my own living room. But something was different. The stress patterns in the rock looked wrong, like the stone had been squeezed by enormous pressure. There were cracks that weren't there before, running in straight lines instead of following the natural grain. I called it in to my supervisor, and by afternoon, we had a full search team assembled. 6 rangers, 2 local volunteer cavers, and equipment for a 3-day underground operation. Standard cave rescue protocol. We'd done it before, but I had this feeling in my gut that this wasn't going to be standard anything. The Cherokee guides who sometimes worked with us had been acting strange all week. Old Jimmy Crow Feather, who'd been taking people into these caves longer than I'd been alive, refused to go below ground. Said the caves were angry and that we should wait for them to calm down before going deeper. I should have listened to him. We went down at dawn on Wednesday. The cave entrance felt different somehow. The air was wrong. Usually, cave air is perfectly still, almost dead. But there were little breezes coming from passages that should have been sealed off. The temperature was still 54 degrees, but it felt colder. Our first stop was the chamber where I'd found the equipment. I wanted to show the team the geometric arrangements, the strange stress patterns in the walls. When we got there, everything had changed. The equipment was gone, completely gone, like it had never been there. But the geometric patterns were still pressed into the cave floor, only now they were carved into solid limestone. Grooves an inch deep, cut with perfect precision. You'd need diamond tools to make marks like that, and it would take hours of work. Nobody had been down there since I left the day before. The chamber was locked off, and I had the only key. Tommy Rodriguez, one of my best rangers, knelt down to examine the grooves. "Bill, this is impossible. Look at these edges. They're perfectly smooth, and they go right through solid rock." I was studying the wall formations when I heard Jenny Blackwater, our newest ranger, call out from the far end of the chamber. "Hey, there's a passage here that's not on the map." We all turned to look. She was standing next to what appeared to be a natural archway leading deeper into the cave system. The thing is, I'd mapped this chamber myself 6 years earlier. There had been no passage there. Just solid limestone wall. Tommy was already shaking his head. "That can't be right. I've been down here a dozen times. There's no passage there." But there it was. A tunnel about 6 feet high, perfectly round, leading down into darkness. The walls were smooth, almost polished, like they'd been carved by running water. But there were no watermarks, no mineral deposits. Just clean, white limestone that seemed to glow faintly in our headlamp beams. "Maybe there was a small cave-in that opened it up," suggested Mark Chen, Sarah's brother who'd volunteered for the search. "Sometimes rock falls can reveal new passages." I walked over to examine the entrance. No loose rock, no debris, no signs of any kind of collapse. The passage looked like it had been there for thousands of years. The limestone was worn smooth, aged to that white-gray color that only comes with centuries of exposure to cave air. But I knew it hadn't been there 2 days ago. We followed protocol. 2-person teams, constant radio contact, map everything as we go. Tommy and I took point, with Jenny and Mark following 50 feet behind. The other team stayed in the main chamber as backup. The new passage sloped downward at a gentle angle, curving left and right like a natural watercourse. Our footsteps echoed strangely. Sometimes the sound carried for what seemed like miles. Other times it was absorbed immediately, like the cave was swallowing the noise. After maybe 200 yards, we found the first sign of Dr. Chen's team. Sarah Chen's notebook open to her last entry, sitting on a natural ledge in the passage wall. The pages weren't damaged, weren't even damp, despite the cave's humidity. But the words on the page made my blood run cold. The walls are moving. Jim thinks it's an optical illusion from our headlamps, but I can see the limestone shifting, like it's breathing. The passage we came through is different now, narrower. We should go back, but the way back doesn't look right anymore. Something's watching us from the deep places, something that doesn't want us here. The entry was dated 3:47 p.m., November 15th. The same time, their other equipment notes stopped. Tommy was examining the ledge where we found the notebook. "Bill, look at this." He was pointing to handprints pressed into the limestone. Human handprints, but sunk an inch deep into solid rock, like someone had pressed their hands into wet cement. 5 sets of handprints. The research team. I radioed back to base camp, but got only static. Radio signals usually worked fine in the upper passages, but something was interfering with the signal. We were on our own. "We should go back," Jenny said, and I could hear the fear in her voice. "This isn't natural. None of this is natural." She was right, but we couldn't leave without the missing team. 5 people were depending on us. We kept going deeper. The passage opened into a vast chamber that definitely wasn't on any map. Our headlamp beams couldn't find the ceiling or the far walls. The space felt enormous, like we were standing inside a cathedral, but the walls we could see were covered with symbols, carved deep into the limestone, following the Cherokee patterns I'd seen in museums. And scattered around the chamber floor were more personal belongings. A geology hammer, a coil of rope, a water bottle with Dr. Jim Martinez written on the side in black marker. All of it arranged in those same geometric patterns, circles within circles. That's when we heard the breathing. The sound came from everywhere at once, deep, slow breathing that seemed to match the rhythm of the cave itself, like the limestone walls were expanding and contracting with each breath. "What the hell is that?" Tommy whispered, but I was already backing toward the passage entrance. The breathing was getting louder. Not closer. Louder, like someone was turning up the volume on massive lungs somewhere in the darkness beyond our lights. Jenny grabbed my arm. "The passage. Look at the passage." I turned around. The entrance we'd come through was different, smaller. The perfectly round tunnel had become an oval, maybe 4 feet high instead of 6. The smooth walls were rough now, studded with sharp limestone projections that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier. "That's impossible," Mark whispered. "Stone doesn't change. Stone doesn't move." But I was starting to understand that impossible didn't mean anything down here. Our radios crackled with static, and through the interference, I heard base camp trying to reach us. "Bill, do you copy? We're showing seismic activity on our equipment. Minor tremors throughout the cave system. What's your status?" I tried to respond, but my radio was dead. Complete silence. The breathing sound stopped suddenly, leaving us in the kind of absolute quiet that only exists deep underground. In that silence, we heard something worse. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps coming from the darkness beyond our headlamp beams. But these weren't human footsteps. Too slow, too heavy, with low, long pauses between each step. Like something enormous was walking carefully, trying not to make noise. Tommy drew his service weapon. Park rangers aren't cops, but we carry guns for dealing with dangerous wildlife. "Stay behind me," he said, which would have been reassuring if we had any idea what we were dealing with. The footsteps got closer, and I realized they were coming from above us. Something was walking on the chamber ceiling, defying gravity like the laws of physics meant nothing. "We need to leave. Now," I said. But when we turned back to our exit passage, it was gone. The wall was solid limestone, unmarked, like there had never been an opening there at all. We were trapped. Jenny was shining her light around the chamber, trying to find another way out, when she screamed. Not a little scared yelp, but a full-throated scream of absolute terror. In the beam of her headlamp, pressed into the limestone wall at eye level, was a human face. Eyes closed, mouth open, like someone had been pushed into the rock while screaming. The features were perfectly preserved, down to individual eyelashes. It was Dr. Sarah Chen. "Jesus Christ," Mark whispered. "Sarah? Sarah!" He ran toward the wall, but I grabbed him, because I could see what he couldn't from his angle. It wasn't just Sarah's face in the wall. There were others. 4 other faces, positioned around the chamber at different heights. The entire research team, embedded in solid limestone like insects in amber. But their eyes were moving. All 5 faces, their eyes were open now and tracking our movement. Sarah's mouth was moving too, trying to say something, but no sound came out. The limestone around her lips shifted slightly, like the rock was somehow fluid. The footsteps above us stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat and Tommy's rapid breathing next to me. Then something spoke. The voice, "See," came from the walls themselves, deep and resonant, like an earthquake-given speech. It spoke in Cherokee first, words I didn't understand, but that felt ancient and angry. Then it switched to English, each word carefully pronounced like it was remembering how to speak our language. "Sacred places are not for your kind. You dig in burial grounds. You map what should stay. Hidden, you disturb the sleeping stones." A section of the chamber wall began to shift and flow like water. Limestone rippled and reformed, and something massive began to emerge from the rock itself. First an enormous hand, fingers as thick as tree branches, then an arm, then a shoulder. It was coming out of the wall like it was stepping through a doorway. I'd found the source of those impossible handprints from earlier. Hands that could crush a man's skull like an eggshell, connected to something that made the cave itself its body. The Cherokee were right. There were stone giants in the deep places, and we had invaded their sacred space. The creature that emerged from the limestone wall stood 12 feet tall, its body composed of living rock. Its skin was the same white-gray limestone as the cave walls, but it moved like flesh. Its eyes were crystal formations that glowed with their own inner light, casting blue-white beams that made our headlamps seem pathetic. When it spoke again, I felt the vibrations in my chest. "I am guardian of the deep places, keeper of Cherokee bones. You have violated sacred burial chambers. You have brought machines to map spirit paths. The ancestors are angry." Tommy still had his gun drawn, but I put my hand on his arm. Bullets weren't going to help us here. "We didn't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We were just looking for the missing research team. We didn't mean to disturb anything sacred." The stone giant's crystal eyes fixed on me. "You are the one who brings others to sacred places, year after year, leading strangers through spirit paths. You know Cherokee warnings. You ignore Cherokee wisdom." It was right, and I knew. So the tribal elders had been telling us for years that certain sections of the cave were off limits, sacred burial sites that should never be disturbed. But we'd ignored them, treated their warnings like superstition. "The missing researchers," I said. "Where are they? Are they—" I couldn't finish the question. The guardian gestured toward the faces embedded in the chamber walls. "They live within the stone now, safe from the poison of upper world, breathing through limestone lungs, dreaming through limestone dreams. They violated the deepest sacred chambers, so they become part of sacred stone forever." "You can't just trap people in rock," Mark shouted. "That's my sister. You have to let her go." The guardian turned its massive head toward him. She mapped burial sites, drew pictures of sacred bones for outsider museums, desecrated ancestor resting places with measuring tools and cameras. The stone claims all who disturb sacred rest. The chamber began to shake. Not an earthquake. Something much more controlled. The guardian was reshaping the space around us, walls flowing like water, ceiling lowering, floor rising, creating a limestone prison that would hold us forever. "Wait!" I yelled over the grinding sound of moving rock. "There has to be another way. Some kind of ceremony or ritual, something to make this right." The Guardian paused. The chamber stopped changing, but we were now in a space maybe half the original size. I could feel tons of limestone suspended above our heads, held back only by this creature's will. "You know Cherokee ways?" it asked. I thought about Jimmy Crow Feather, about all the times he'd tried to teach me about his people's relationship with the caves, the stories I'd dismissed as folklore, the ceremonies I'd never bothered to learn about. "I know someone who does," I said. "Jimmy Crow Feather. He's been trying to teach me for years, but I never listened. If you let us go, I'll learn. I'll make sure the sacred places stay protected." The Guardian was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You will seal violated chambers. Forever. No more maps. No more strangers in sacred spaces. You will guard Cherokee secrets as Cherokee guard them." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "Yes," I said. "I promise." "Promise on your ancestors' bones," the Guardian said. "Promise on your children's lives. Promise on the stone itself." I looked at Tommy, at Jenny, at Mark, at the faces of the research team embedded in the walls, their eyes pleading with me, at the tons of limestone that could crush us all in seconds. "I promise on all of it," I said, "on my honor as a keeper of this place." The Guardian raised one massive stone hand and pressed it against my chest. I felt the limestone flow around my body like liquid, cool and solid at the same time. For a moment, I thought I was about to join the faces in the wall. Instead, I felt something change inside me, like the cave itself was becoming part of me, connecting me to every tunnel, every chamber, every sacred space in the entire system. I could feel the Cherokee burial sites like points of warmth in the darkness. I could sense where every tourist group was located, what passages were safe, and which ones were protected. I had become part of the cave's nervous system. The Guardian released me and stepped backward. "You are bound to the stone now. Guardian like me, but still human, still able to walk in both worlds. Protect sacred places, or the stone will claim you too." The chamber walls began to flow again, reforming into their original shape. The research team's faces sank deeper into the limestone until only faint outlines remained. Not gone, just sleeping, like the Guardian had said. Dreaming through limestone dreams until someone found a way to properly atone for their violation of sacred space. We made it back to the surface just as our backup team was preparing to come looking for us. They found us in the main chamber, disoriented and suffering from what the doctors called cave sickness, a condition that supposedly affects some people who spend too much time in deep limestone formations. The official report blamed the missing research team's disappearance on geological instability in unmapped sections. The affected chambers were sealed off permanently for public safety. No mention of stone guardians or Cherokee sacred sites. But I kept my promise. Working with Jimmy Crow Feather and the Cherokee Nation, we established new protocols for cave access. Certain areas are now completely off limits, protected by both federal law and tribal authority. The tourist routes were modified to avoid sacred sites. Archaeological research requires tribal permission and spiritual consultation. Tommy transferred to another park 6 months later, said he couldn't handle being underground anymore. Jenny lasted 2 years before she moved to a job in Colorado. Mark Chen never got over losing his sister to the limestone. He started a foundation for cave safety, but I know he's really looking for a way to get her back. They all think the research team died in a cave-in. Only I know they're still down there, part of the sacred stone, waiting for the day when proper ceremonies can be performed to release them. I still work at Mammoth Cave, still guide tours through the safe passages. But now I can feel the Guardian watching whenever I take groups underground. Sometimes, in the deepest chambers, I hear limestone breathing. Tourists think it's just the natural acoustics of the cave system. They don't know how right they are. The Cherokee were correct about the stone giants in the deep places. They were correct about the sacred burial chambers. They were correct about the dangers of disturbing spaces that should be left alone. I learned to listen to their warnings. I learned that some places in this world are not meant for our maps and measuring tools. Some places are meant to stay hidden, protected by guardians who remember when the caves were temples instead of tourist attractions. Late at night, when the park is closed and the caves are empty of visitors, I sometimes go down to the sealed chambers. I can hear the research team in there, their voices echoing through limestone lungs. They're not in pain. The Guardian was telling the truth about that. They're just waiting for someone to figure out the right ceremony, the proper offerings, the correct words to speak to the stone. Jimmy Crow. Feather is helping me learn, but Cherokee's spiritual knowledge isn't something you can rush. It takes years to understand, decades to master. Until then, they'll keep dreaming through limestone dreams. And I'll keep guarding the sacred places, making sure no one else joins them in the stone. Because I made a promise to something older than human civilization, something that remembers when the Cherokee first entered these caves and declared them holy. A promise I'll keep until the day I die, or until the day the Guardian decides I've failed and claims me for the limestone too. The caves are still sacred. The stone giants still watch from the deep places, and some secrets are worth more than human curiosity. My name is Maria Delgado, and I've been a ranger at Grand Canyon National Park for 14 years. Before that, I spent 6 years flying jets for the Air Force. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand. I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghost stories or giant bird myths. I deal in facts, wind speed, engine failure, pilot error, things you can measure and fix. But what happened in the spring of 1989 changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I was 39 then, working as the aviation safety coordinator for the North Rim operations. My job was simple: keep helicopters flying safely over one of the most dangerous pieces of airspace in America. The Grand Canyon isn't just a pretty hole in the ground. It's a death trap for pilots who don't respect it. Mile-deep walls create wind shear that can flip a helicopter upside down in seconds. Thermal updrafts shoot up from the canyon floor like invisible geysers. I'd logged over 3,000 hours flying in those conditions, and I knew every wind pattern, every dangerous spot, every safe landing zone. The North Rim is different from the tourist side. Fewer people, more wilderness, and access only by helicopter to most of the backcountry areas. That's where the tour companies made their money, flying rich folks to spots no tourist bus could reach. Places at 7,000 feet elevation where the air gets thin and the weather turns mean without warning. It was late May when the storm season started acting weird. I checked the weather reports each morning and they'd show clear skies. Then by afternoon, these little storms would pop up out of nowhere. Not big ones, just enough to create dangerous flying conditions. Downdrafts that came from clear blue sky. Lightning strikes when there wasn't a cloud in sight. The other rangers started joking about it. "Maria's weather is acting up again," they'd say. But it wasn't funny to me. Unpredictable weather kills pilots. That's when I first heard about the Hopi legends from Tom Yazzie, one of our cultural liaisons. He was Hopi, born and raised on the reservation, and he knew stories his grandfather had told him. "The Thunderbirds are waking up," he said one morning over coffee. "My grandfather always said they protect the sacred places. Maybe someone's getting too close." I laughed it off. Giant eagles that control storms? Come on. I was a pilot. I knew what caused weather. But Tom wasn't smiling. "Maria, my people have lived here for 1,000 years. We know things about this canyon that aren't in your flight manuals." 3 days later, the first helicopter went down. It was a beautiful Tuesday morning, not a cloud in the sky. Perfect flying weather, the kind of day that makes you remember why you love aviation. Sky tours. Flight 47 was a routine run, 4 passengers wanting to see the hidden waterfalls in the backcountry. Pilot was Jake Morrison, 15 years experience, knew the canyon like his own backyard. I'd flown with Jake dozens of times. He was careful, methodical, the kind of pilot who checked everything twice. The flight plan took them to Deer Creek Falls, about 20 miles northwest of the visitor center. Sacred site to the Hopi, but the tour companies had permission to fly over it, just barely. At 10:47 a.m., Jake radioed in his position. Normal voice, normal conditions. "Beautiful day out here, Maria. Passengers are getting some great photos." At 10:51 a.m., his radio went silent. We found the wreckage that afternoon, scattered across 3 miles of canyon. The weird part wasn't just that Jake had crashed. The weird part was where we found the pieces. The main body of the helicopter was on a ledge halfway down the canyon wall. The rotor blades were on the opposite rim. The engine was at the bottom of a side canyon, 2 miles away. No wind that day, no storm, no reason for a helicopter to break apart like that. 2 passengers survived with broken bones and severe trauma. When I interviewed them at the hospital, they kept talking about birds. Giant birds, Sarah Chen whispered, her arm in a cast, eyes wide with shock. Bigger than the helicopter. They came out of nowhere. Her husband Mark nodded frantically. 3 of them, flying in formation, wings like airplane wings, but they were alive. They surrounded us, and then he started shaking. I wrote it up as hallucinations from head trauma. What else could I do? The next morning, I got a call from Flagstaff Air Traffic Control. Maria, you need to see these radar tapes from yesterday. I drove down that afternoon. The controller, a guy named Pete I'd known for years, pulled up the recordings from Jake's flight. Look at this, he said, pointing at the screen. 10:48 a.m., Jake's helicopter shows up normal. But look what happens at 10:49. 3 massive contacts appeared on the radar. They moved at impossible speeds. 200 miles per hour 1 second, dead stop the next. They surrounded Jake's helicopter, and then all 4 contacts disappeared from the screen. Equipment malfunction, Pete said, but he didn't sound convinced. Had to be. Nothing flies like that. I stared at the screen. The 3 contacts had been huge, bigger than any aircraft I knew. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Sarah Chen's terrified whisper. Giant birds. I started pulling weather data from that morning. What I found made my stomach drop. At exactly 10:49 a.m., a localized storm cell had formed directly over Jake's flight path. Temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 minutes. Wind speed jumped from 5 to 60 miles per hour. Then, at 10:52 a.m., clear skies again, a 3-minute storm that appeared and disappeared with no atmospheric cause. I called Tom Yazzie that night. Tell me about these Thunderbirds. His voice was quiet. You starting to believe, Maria? Just tell me. Thunderbirds are the storm eagles, bigger too. Than any bird you've ever seen. They control the weather, thunder, lightning, wind. They nest in the sacred places and protect them from people who don't belong. How big? Wingspan like a small airplane. My grandfather said 40 feet, maybe more. They hunt in groups of 3, like fighter jets. Smart as people, maybe smarter. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, staring at the wall. 40-foot wingspan. 3 of them, flying in formation, just like the radar contacts. I grounded all helicopter operations pending investigation. The tour companies went crazy, screaming about lost revenue, threatening lawsuits. But I'd rather deal with angry executives than dead pilots. For 2 days, the canyon was quiet. No flights, no incidents. I started thinking maybe the storm was just a freak weather event. Maybe Sarah Chen really had been hallucinating. Then I got the call to investigate the wreckage more carefully. The insurance company wanted every piece of that helicopter examined. I took my own helicopter up, a Park Service Bell 206, one I'd been flying for 3 years. My plan was simple: check the crash site, collect any remaining debris, file my report. Just another day of cleanup work. The flight started normal. Clear skies, light winds, perfect visibility. I followed the same route Jake had taken, heading northwest toward Deer Creek Falls. As I got close to the sacred site, something felt wrong. The air got thick and heavy, like before a thunderstorm, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. My radio started crackling with static. The helicopter began vibrating in a way I'd never felt before. Then I saw them. 3 shapes rose up from the canyon depths, climbing toward me with impossible grace. At first, my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Birds, it said, just really big birds. But as they got closer, I realized how wrong that was. These weren't just teod big birds. They were massive. Wings that stretched 40 feet from tip to tip. bodies the size of small cars. Their feathers were dark brown and black, but they shimmered with an electric blue that made the air around them seem to sparkle. Their eyes were golden and intelligent, not animal intelligence, but something deeper, something that knew exactly what it was doing. They flew in perfect formation, like the Blue Angels, but with a power and presence that made my Air Force training seem like kindergarten games. The lead bird looked straight at me through my windscreen. I felt a jolt of recognition, like it knew who I was. Then all three of them began to circle my helicopter. The wind hit me like a brick wall. My aircraft started spinning, caught in downdrafts that came from nowhere. The engine began to strain as the air pressure changed around me. Lightning flickered between the bird's wings, not random strikes, but controlled energy that danced from feather to feather. I fought the controls, using every trick I'd learned in 20 years of flying. But these birds weren't just creating weather. They were controlling it with surgical precision. They could have destroyed my helicopter in seconds, but they didn't. Instead, they herded me, pushing me away from the sacred site like sheepdogs moving livestock. The message was clear: stay away. I managed to get my helicopter stable and flew straight back to base, my hands shaking on the controls. When I landed, my maintenance crew found something that made everyone go quiet. 3 deep scratches on the aircraft's belly, parallel lines that went right through the metal, like claw marks from something impossibly large and strong. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I called in sick and drove to the Hopi Reservation to find Tom's grandfather. His name was Joseph Yazzie, and he was 93 years old. His house was a small trailer on dusty ground, but his eyes were sharp and clear when Tom introduced me. "You saw them," he said before I could speak. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he nodded, slowly. "Sit down, Ranger. Time you learned the truth about this place." For 2 hours, Joseph told me stories his grandfather had told him. Stories about the Thunderbirds, the storm eagles that had guarded the sacred sites since the beginning of time, how they could create hurricanes with their wings and direct lightning with their thoughts, how they were protectors, not destroyers, but they would kill anyone who threatened the sacred places. "They're testing you," Joseph said. "You have power over the flying machines. They want to know, are you friend or enemy? What happens if they decide I'm an enemy?" Joseph's ancient eyes met mine. "Then you'll join the others who thought they could take what doesn't belong to them." The next morning, I found out what he meant. 2 more helicopters had tried to reach the sacred sites overnight, private aircraft that had ignored the flight restrictions. We found both wrecks at sunrise, their pilots dead, their aircraft torn apart by forces that made no scientific sense. The Thunderbirds were done with warnings. The phone call came at 6 a.m. on Friday morning. Colonel James Wright from Nellis Air Force Base, his voice sharp and military. "Ranger Delgado, we're taking over your bird situation." "My what?" "Large predatory birds interfering with aircraft operations. We're sending a strike team to eliminate the threat." My blood went cold. "Colonel, you don't understand what you're dealing with." "I understand perfectly. We've reviewed the radar data. We've examined the wreckage. Hostile wildlife threatening air safety. Standard protocol is elimination." I tried to explain. Tried to tell him these weren't ordinary birds, that they were protecting sacred sites, that killing them would be a disaster. But Colonel Wright had made up his mind. "Strike team launches at 0800 hours. Keep your people clear of the operational area, the air RFs." Orse came with 2 Apache attack helicopters and a Black Hawk full of soldiers. Military-grade firepower designed to eliminate any threat. They flew straight toward the sacred sites like they owned the sky. I was in my own helicopter, watching from a safe distance when the Thunderbirds rose to meet them. What happened next still gives me nightmares. The sky turned black in seconds. Clouds boiled up from nowhere, forming a wall of storm that stretched across the entire canyon. Lightning began striking everything. Not random bolts, but targeted strikes that hit exactly what the Thunderbirds wanted them to hit. The Apache helicopters never had a chance. The Thunderbirds moved through the storm like it was calm air, their wings generating winds that flipped military aircraft like toys. Lightning struck both Apaches simultaneously, sending them spinning into the canyon walls. The Black Hawk tried to run, but the storm followed it. I watched hurricane-force winds pick up a 10,000-pound aircraft and throw it 5 miles like a paper airplane. In minutes, it was over. 3 military aircraft destroyed, 9 soldiers dead, and the Thunderbirds circling the wreckage like judges. Then the storm turned toward me. I'd seen what they could do to military hardware. My little Park Service helicopter wouldn't last 10 seconds. But as the wall of black clouds approached, something told me to stay calm, to not run. The lead Thunderbird broke away from the others and flew straight at me. It was enormous up close, bigger than my helicopter, more graceful than anything had a right to be. It hovered 20 feet away, its golden eyes staring into mine. And somehow, I understood what it wanted. It wanted to know whose side I was on. I thought about the tour companies, demanding access to sacred sites for profit. About the military, trying to kill creatures that were just protecting their home. About 14 years of watching people treat the canyon like it belonged to them. I switched off my engine and let my helicopter drop toward a ledge, a controlled landing in IMO possible conditions. But somehow I made it work. Then I got out and stood on the rock, looking up at the massive bird hovering above me. "I'm not your enemy," I said out loud, feeling stupid but doing it anyway. "I want to protect this place too." The Thunderbird studied me for a long moment. Then it let out a call that echoed through the entire canyon. Not a bird sound, but something deeper. Something that spoke to parts of my mind I didn't know existed. The storm began to fade. The other 2 Thunderbirds joined their leader, and all 3 of them looked at me with what I can only describe as approval. Then they flew away, disappearing into the depths of the canyon. But I knew they'd be watching. The official report blamed the military helicopter crashes on unexpected severe weather conditions. No mention of giant birds or Thunderbirds. The Air Force quietly shelved any plans for future wildlife elimination operations. I spent the next month working with Tom Yazzie and the Hopi Tribal Council to establish permanent no-fly zones over the sacred sites. I used aviation safety regulations as justification: dangerous wind conditions, unpredictable weather patterns, risk of aircraft collision with canyon walls. All technically true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. The tour companies fought me every step of the way, but they couldn't argue with the crash statistics. 5 helicopters destroyed in 2 weeks, 14 people dead. Even the greediest executive couldn't ignore those numbers. Colonel Wright called once more 3 weeks after the attack. His voice was different, quieter, less sure of himself. "Delgado, what really happened out there?" "Severe weather, sir, just like the report says." A long pause. "Those birds, how big were they really?" "I don't know what you mean, Colonel. Birds don't show up on radar." Another pause. Then, "Keep those no-fly zones in place, Ranger. Permanently." "Yes, sir." "The Thunderbirds still live in the canyon. I see them sometimes when I'm doing routine patrols near the sacred sites. They're always watching, always protecting. The Hopi elders say they're pleased with our agreement. They've had no problems with aircraft for months now. I got transferred to a desk job 6 months later. Insubordination, they called it. Failure to follow federal aviation guidelines. But the no-fly zones stayed in place, and that's what mattered. These days, I work as a cultural liaison between the Park Service and the Hopi tribe. I train new rangers in aviation safety, with special emphasis on respecting indigenous sacred sites. I never mention the Thunderbirds directly, but I make sure everyone understands that some places in the canyon are off-limits for reasons beyond their understanding. Most of them think I'm just being overly cautious. That's fine with me. Sometimes, on clear days when the wind is right, I can hear them calling to each other across the canyon, the storm eagles, the guardians of sacred places. Their voices echo off the ancient rock walls like thunder, reminding everyone who really owns this land. The tourists still come, and the helicopters still fly. But they stay away from certain areas now, following flight paths that respect boundaries older than any government regulation. The sacred sites remain protected, watched over by creatures most people will never see, and wouldn't believe in if they did. I sleep better at night, knowing they're out there. The Thunderbirds of Grand Canyon, keeping the balance between our world and theirs. Some myths, it turns out, are just truths waiting to be understood.